4 silver coins to the treasury, a castle with a collapsed tower, 3 impoverished villages, and a broken road leading nowhere. The new lord reads this paper and instead of resting after his journey, utters a single word: market. And just 30 seconds ago, his name was Daniel Hale, and he was speeding down the highway near Singapore until his eyes closed of their own accord. He woke up in a jolting carriage, in a young, unfamiliar body with calluses in all the wrong places, in unfamiliar clothes. Across from him sits an old man with thin lips and a folder of papers, calling him Lord Lomark. A modest inheritance. There were almost no debts. Daniel looked out the window at the gray hills and a crooked windmill missing a blade, and he recognized the place. Not the place itself, the state of affairs. Dirt, ruin, people who don't believe tomorrow will be better than yesterday. 20 years ago, he stood on a vacant lot in Lagos, and 2 years later, a hub handling 4,000 containers a day was humming there. In Dhaka, he started with a rice warehouse and 3 loaders. In Yangon, with a single pier and 2 tugboats. It's the same story every time. And every time he knew what to do. Manager Olvin urges him to tour the castle and take a break. Daniel shakes his head. The castle can wait. No market. The carriage turns onto a bumpy road and 15 minutes later, he steps out onto a square half the size of a soccer field. 15 stalls in 2 crooked rows. Merchants sit behind 7 of them. The rest are empty. Turnips. Dried fish of a dubious color. Chipped pots. Daniel walks along the row and fixes his gaze on the 5th stall. Behind it stands an old woman with a weather-beaten face and red hands. Before her are bundles of pale turnip greens. Next to her, a merchant in a traveling cloak with 2 mules tosses bundle after bundle into a sack. A copper coin per bundle. He doesn't haggle. He tosses and tosses until the stall is empty. He flings a handful of copper coins onto the board and walks away. Daniel sits down on an upside-down crate and asks the old woman. Her name is Merit. It takes half a day to gather 1 bundle. The swamp is far away. The roots run deep. Her back aches. 20 bundles a week, if she's lucky. 20 copper coins. But in the capital, the same root sells for a silver coin per bundle. 1 silver coin is 40 copper coins. The merchant buys for a copper coin. He sells for 40, a difference of 39 times. Daniel knows this scheme by heart. He's seen it in every port of every impoverished country where he's worked. The middleman who controls the trade takes 97%. The producer gets crumbs. And everyone assumes it's always been this way and always will be. He isn't angry at the merchant. The merchant is acting rationally. The problem isn't the merchant. The problem is that there's no system here. Daniel stands up and says 3 words. Show me the castle. Lomark Castle stands on a hill 2 miles away. The walls are intact but cracked. One of the 4 towers has collapsed. The gate hangs crookedly. The grass in the courtyard is waist-high. Inside, it's damp and cold. The hall's roof is leaking. The kitchen has a single hearth. An empty chest in the study. A hay mattress in the bedroom. Daniel takes it all in. He doesn't know the local dialect, but he has a photographer's memory. 10 years of mapping routes across 6 countries. He keeps hundreds of details in his head. Then Alvin leads him to the basement. And that's when Daniel freezes. The basement is enormous, far larger than you'd expect for a castle of this size. Stone walls descend 3 levels. High ceilings. Neat, rectangular niches line the walls, like shelves. Storage shelves. On the far wall, a wide arch leads into the darkness. Alvin says he's never gone any further. It's dark and dangerous in there. Daniel stands in front of the arch for a minute. Then he turns around and heads upstairs. That can wait. First the road. First the market. First Merit and her route for a copper coin. For the rest of the day, he sits in his office and questions Alvin. There are about 800 people in the 3 villages. Almost all of them work the land. They grow turnips, barley, and a little flax. 3 blacksmiths, a potter, 2 weavers, and a carpenter who drinks more than he builds. 1 road leads south to the pass and on to Kant Almore, 4 days' journey. 1 leads north to Villard, 6 days. 1 leads east, almost impassable. Daniel is mapping it out in his head. Not a geographical one, a logistical one. Lomark sits between 3 kingdoms like a dot at the intersection of 3 lines. Right now, it's a dead end. Nothing passes through it because the road is in ruins, and there's no reason to stop here. But what if the road were repaired? What if traveling through Lowmark became faster and cheaper than taking a detour? If so, merchants had a reason to stop by instead of driving right past. Daniel leans back in his chair. It creaks ominously. Tomorrow morning he needs all the village elders, all the artisans, everyone who trades at the market. Olven asks why. To listen. Just to listen. Olven says that in 30 years of service to 3 lords, not a single one has ever asked to hear the peasants out. Daniel shrugs. That's the first mistake he'll correct. At night, he lies on a hay mattress. The ceiling leaks in 2 places. The wind from the hills howls through the walls like an empty pipe. And Daniel thinks about the basement, about the smooth niches, about the archway leading into the darkness. He's seen thousands of warehouses, in Rotterdam, in Dubai, in Shanghai. What lies under lock and key isn't a cellar or a wine cellar. It's a Class A warehouse with a well-designed storage system. Whoever built it long before him. Someone who thought exactly as he did. And that thought keeps him awake. At dawn, he stands in the courtyard and watches people make their way up the path. Hefty Thorn from Westhall. Thin, nervous Quinn from Hazelmere. Elderly Agnes from Mossbridge. Behind them come blacksmiths, a potter, weavers, and merchants. Merritt comes too, even though no one called her. She heard and came. 40 people look at the new lord with the same expression. Anticipation of bad news. Daniel knows that look. He saw it on the faces of the dock workers in Mombasa. Now they're going to say something bad. Raise taxes. Take away their land. Send them to war. But Daniel doesn't give a speech. He sits down on a rock by the well and asks each person to name one thing. What's keeping them from living better? The most important thing. Thorne speaks up first. The road. The wheel breaks on every other trip. Quinn talks about the bandits at the pass who take 2 copper coins from everyone. Agnes talks about the well that's run dry, forcing the women to walk 3 miles for water. The blacksmith talks about the coal they haul from Kant Almore at the price of gold. Merritt talks about the cost. She works from dawn till dusk, yet her money is barely enough for food. Daniel listens for 2 hours. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't argue. He doesn't make any promises. He listens and takes it all in. When the last one falls silent, he stands up. He hears them. He won't promise everything right away, but he'll do one thing in the first week. The road. The first 3 miles from Westhall to the market. The worst stretch. Thorne asks where the money will come from. There's no money, Daniel replies, but there's stone in the hills. There are hands. And there's one idea. Everyone who works on the road for 3 days will receive a warehouse receipt, a document bearing the Lord's seal. It can be exchanged for goods in the castle warehouse or used to pay at the market. The people exchange glances. How is a receipt better than a promise? Thorne asks. A receipt isn't a promise, Daniel replies. It's a document, a seal, a date, an amount. You can't backdate it, and anyone who accepts it can come to the castle and verify that there are goods in the warehouse worth that amount. The people are silent. They don't understand. Daniel sees this, and he doesn't explain any further. He says he'll show them. Tomorrow. In action. On the morning of the 3rd day, Daniel stood on the most dilapidated stretch of road between Westhall and the market. 23 people stood nearby with shovels and pickaxes. Most had come out of curiosity, some out of hunger. One blacksmith named Bran came because he was bored and wanted to see the new lord make a fool of himself. Daniel didn't know how to build roads. He knew that, but he knew else. He knew how to organize 23 people so they wouldn't get in each other's way. In Lagos, he had once coordinated the unloading of 300 containers using 60 dock workers who didn't speak a common language. This was easier. He divided the men into 3 groups. The first breaks up the rock on the hill and hauls them downhill. The second was leveling the ground. The third was laying the stone. Each group worked on its own section. When one finished, the next one started. An assembly line system, a conveyor belt. The men didn't know that word, but they understood the principle within half an hour. By noon on the first day, 20 paces of road had been laid. That wasn't much, but the stone lay flat and tight, and the wagon rolled over it without a single creak. Thorne kicked the stone with his foot. Then he looked at Daniel. then back at the stone. He didn't say anything, but the next morning he brought 11 more men. By the end of the first week, the road had advanced half a mile. Daniel issued the first warehouse receipts, 23 pieces of paper bearing his seal, each for 2 copper coins worth of goods. Olven looked at these papers with the expression of a man watching his lord go mad. He asked what backed these receipts if the warehouse was empty. Daniel replied that the receipts were backed by the future turnip harvest from Thorn's field. Thorn confirmed this. Olven jotted down a new word in his notebook, futures. Daniel had mentioned it in passing, and then spent 10 minutes explaining what it meant. Olven wrote down the explanation on 2 pages and underlined it 3 times. On the 8th day, the first small miracle occurred. Merritt came to the castle with a sack of marsh root. Not to the market, to the castle. She said she'd heard about the receipts. She wanted to deliver the root to the warehouse and receive a receipt. Daniel was sitting in his office when Olven brought her in. He looked at the sack. He looked at Merritt, and he asked her a question that made the old herbalist freeze. He asked if she knew how much her root was actually worth. Merritt said a copper coin per bunch. That's how it had always been. Daniel shook his head. He said that in the capital of Kant, Almora, doctors buy this root for a silver coin. 1 silver coin is 40 copper coins. Merritt was worth 40 times more than she was getting paid. The problem isn't the root. The problem is the journey to the capital. Merritt can't go there alone. It's a 4-day journey. There are bandits. There are tolls at the bridge. There are overnight stays at inns where she could get robbed. The cost of transportation eats up the entire difference. But if the root isn't shipped alone, but along with other goods, if 10 herbalists deliver their roots to a single warehouse, if a single caravan carries everything together, then the cost of the journey is divided by 10. And instead of 1 copper coin, Merritt could get 15 copper coins per bunch, not 40. 15. Because the journey still costs money. Because the caravan needs to be guarded. Because Daniel has to make a living too, or the whole system will collapse. But 15 copper coins is 15 times more than 1 copper coin. Merritt was silent for a long time. Then she asked why he was doing this. What was in it for him? Daniel answered honestly. He said he would take 3 copper coins from each bundle as payment for storage and delivery. Of the 40 copper coins the doctor in the capital pays, 15 go to Merritt. 3 go to the Lord. 22 go toward travel, security, and expenses. Merritt counted in her head, moving her lips slowly. Then she nodded. She said she agreed. Daniel wrote her the first warehouse receipt for a sack of marsh root. Merritt held the paper with both hands and looked at it as if it were a letter from God. 3 days later, 4 more herbalists arrived. A week later, there were 12 of them. The marsh root lay in the castle's cellar, neatly arranged in niches in the walls. Those very same niches that Daniel had noticed on his first day. They fit perfectly, as if they had been made specifically for this purpose. Daniel tried not to think about it too much. At the same time, he was tackling a second problem. The road was being built, but slowly. 34 men worked every day, but there wasn't enough stone. They had to quarry it on the hill and then carry them down by hand. Daniel went to see Bran, the blacksmith. Bran was a broad-shouldered, sullen man who spoke so little that some thought he was mute. Daniel sat down by his forge and watched him work. Bran was forging a horseshoe. His movements were precise and economical. Not a single wasted blow. Daniel said he needed a tool. Not a horseshoe, not a sword. A tool. He described a lever-style crowbar for splitting stone. A long steel bar with a pointed end and a thickened section in the middle. You insert it into a crack. You press down on the long end. The stone splits with minimal effort. The principle of a lever. Bran listened in silence. Then he asked how the Lord knew about such things. Daniel said he'd read about it in books. Bran snorted. He didn't believe him. But in 2 days, he made 3 crowbars. Work on the road sped up threefold. A rock that used to take an hour to split could now be split in 10 minutes. Bran came to see the results. He stood there for a moment. He touched the crowbar. Then he turned to Daniel and said he needed 10 more of them. Daniel said he'd pay with IOUs. Bran said he didn't trust pieces of paper. Daniel said, "All right." He offered another option. Bran makes crowbars. Daniel brings him coal from Kant Almore at half the market price. The coal will arrive with the first caravan carrying marsh route. Return load. The caravan goes to the capital with the route and returns with coal. Bran didn't do the math in his head. He counted on his fingers. Then he held out his hand. They sealed the deal. This was Lomark's second contract. The first was with Merritt, the second with Bran. Both were 1 page long. Both were straightforward. Both were mutually beneficial. That evening, Daniel sat in his office and sketched a diagram on a sheet of paper. Arrows. Nodes. Flows. The route goes that way. Coal goes the other way. Payment is guaranteed by the route. Logs speed up the journey. The road speeds up the caravan. The caravan increases the flow. The flow increases revenue. Revenue finances the next cycle. A closed loop. That's how the hubs in Dubai were built. That's how the hubs in Singapore were built. The only difference is that over there they used spreadsheets, and here it's pen and paper. Alvin peeked into the office and saw the diagram. He stared at the arrows for a long time. Then he asked what kind of map it was. Daniel said it was a cash flow map. Alvin carefully wrote down those words. He asked, "Is this a river?" Daniel smiled and said that in a sense it was. On the 14th day, the first caravan set out from Lomark toward Kant Almore. Caravan was a bit of an exaggeration. 1 wagon, 2 mules, 6 sacks of marsh root, a driver named Gareth, and Daniel himself. Alvin begged him not to go. He said it wasn't fitting for a lord to accompany a wagon carrying roots. Daniel said it was fitting for a lord to know his route, every pothole, every incline, every bridge. He wanted to travel the road himself, to measure it with his body, not a map. 4 days to the capital of Kant Almore. Daniel counted the turns. He memorized the distances between the springs. He marked spots where they could set up a shelter to rest. On the second day, they encountered the very bandits Quinn had spoken of. 3 men with clubs stood by a wooden bridge over a stream. They demanded 2 copper coins for passage. Daniel paid without haggling. Gareth was surprised. He asked why the Lord hadn't argued. Daniel replied that 3 bandits with clubs weren't a problem. It was information. Now he knew where they were stationed, how many there were, and what they were armed with, and how much they charge. In a month, this information would pay for itself 100-fold. Gareth didn't understand, but he remembered. In the capital of Kant Almore, Daniel sold the root for 6 silver coins. A physician named Giram sniffed and crumpled the root for a long time. Then he said the quality was excellent. The marsh root from the Lomark peat bogs was one of the best on the continent. Daniel asked how much the man was willing to buy on a regular basis. Giram replied that he'd take as much as they could bring. Daniel proposed a contract. Delivery once a month. Fixed price. Volume guaranteed. Giram agreed. They signed a 1-page contract. On the way back, Daniel bought 3 sacks of good coal for Bran, 2 sacks of salt, and one thing no one expected from him, a wooden sign. It bore 3 words, Grey Heather Inn. On the way back, Daniel stopped halfway between Lomark and the pass. There was a fork in the road, a level clearing by the road, a spring 50 paces away, a grove for firewood. He told Gareth that an inn would stand here. Gareth looked at the empty clearing and said nothing. Daniel returned to Lomark on the 18th day of his reign, with 6 silver coins, with coal for Bran, with a contract from Dr. Giram, and with a plan he'd been sketching the entire way back on the back of that very contract. Alvin met him at the castle gates and shared 2 pieces of news. The first was good. The road had been extended another quarter mile while he was away. The second was bad. The local priest, Father Kedrick, had come to the castle and demanded a meeting. He said that the new lord was engaging in godless deeds and corrupting the village with pieces of paper bearing seals. Daniel sighed. He handed the silver to Olvin. He took the coal to Branu. He sat down in his study and summoned Father Kedrick. Father Kedrick was a short man with thick eyebrows and a voice that filled the entire room. He entered the study without waiting to be invited to sit down. He sat down. He placed his hands on the table, and he began to speak. He said that pieces of paper with seals were a sin, that the trade in roots was a matter for middlemen, not a lord, that a lord should protect and pray, not count coins like a shopkeeper, that the people were confused, that Merritt now walked around with her nose in the air because she had a piece of paper with a seal in her pocket. That order is crumbling. Daniel listened without interrupting. He knew this kind of resistance. In Mombasa, a union boss had said the same words to him. Order is crumbling. People are confused. The new rules are unnatural. Behind every such objection lay the same thing: fear of losing influence. Daniel didn't argue with Father Kedrick about theology. He asked one thing: how many people attend Sunday services at the church? Kedrick replied that there were 30, sometimes 20. People had become lazy. Daniel nodded. He said that in a month there would be 100. Kedrick raised an eyebrow. Daniel explained, "The road is being built. The market is growing. Soon, people from neighboring villages will start coming to Lowmark, carters and merchants. They'll stay overnight. They'll need somewhere to pray." Kedrick's temple is the only one in the area within a 3-day journey. If Cedric doesn't interfere with trade, then trade will bring parishioners to him. More parishioners mean more donations. More donations mean a new roof for the temple, which has been leaking for 5 years now. Cedric remained silent. Daniel added one more thing. He said he wanted every contract signed at the Lowmark market be sealed with a certificate from the temple. The Lord's seal and the priest's blessing, 2 signatures. This meant that Cedric would become not just a priest, but a guarantor of the integrity of the transactions. His word would be worth money, literally. Cedric sat motionless for a minute. Then he asked why the Lord needed his blessing if the pieces of paper worked just fine on their own. Daniel replied that the papers work because people trust them. And they trust them because there is authority behind them. The Lord's authority is one thing, God's authority is another. Together they are stronger than they are apart. Cedric stood up. He smoothed out his cassock. He said he would think it over. And he left. 3 days later, he returned with a new seal for the temple, which he had carved from wood himself. It bore the symbol of the bright path and the word Lawmark. He said he agreed, but on one condition: 10% of the donations collected on each market day would go to the orphanage he wanted to open. Daniel agreed without hesitation. The orphanage was yet another reason for people to come and stay. Every orphan who grew up in Lowmark would become a worker in Lowmark. Daniel didn't say this out loud, but he thought it. By the end of the first month, the road from West Hall to the market was finished. 3 miles of smooth stone. Wagons covered the distance that used to take half a day in just 2 hours. Thorne brought the first load of turnips along the new road and said he'd lost only 1 turnip. Usually he'd lose a whole sack. Daniel stood by the roadside and watched as the wagon rolled along without a creak or a jolt. It was beautiful. Perhaps the most beautiful thing he'd seen since arriving in this world. A smooth road along which the cargo traveled. The second caravan to Kont Almore set out at the beginning of the second month. Now it consisted of 3 carts: marsh root, dried fish from a fisherman in Hazelmere, and clay pots from a potter, which Daniel had the foresight to wrap in hay so they wouldn't break. The caravan brought coal for bran, fabric for the weavers, and 20 sacks of good wheat flour, which Daniel had bought in bulk at a price 3 times lower than at the Lowmark market. Flour at the Lowmark market was expensive because it was supplied by a single merchant who could charge whatever price he wanted. Now Daniel had brought his own flour and was selling it at the market for a third less. The flour merchant came to see him that very evening. He was angry. He said that the Lord was stifling fair trade. Daniel poured him some tea. He said he wasn't stifling it, but rather leveling the playing field. If the merchant was willing to lower his price to a reasonable level, Daniel would stop transporting the flour himself. Moreover, he would offer the merchant a spot in his warehouse, free for the first month, and access to the caravan route. The merchant could transport his flour on the same wagons returning from the capital. They'd split the travel costs. The merchant did the math in his head. Then he said that the Lord was either a genius or a madman. Daniel replied that, in his experience, the two were usually one and the same. The merchant chuckled. They reached an agreement. The price of flour dropped by 20%. For the first time in many years, the residents of Lowmark could buy white bread even on non-holidays. Agnes from Mossbridge came to the market on Saturday and bought a sack of flour. She stood at the counter and ran her hand through the flour. Then she looked up at the castle on the hill. Alvin told Daniel about it that evening. Daniel said nothing but jotted down a single word in his notebook: Mossbridge, the well. He hadn't forgotten. The water problem in Mossbridge needed a solution, but for now he lacked the resources. For now. In the meantime, Daniel set about something without which no market can operate fairly: standards. He asked Bran to forge 10 identical weights. 1 copper coin's weight, 5 copper coins, 10, 20, 40. Each weight was stamped with the Lowmark mark, the letter L inside a circle. Daniel gathered the merchants and announced a new rule. From this day forward, every item at the Lowmark market must be weighed using the stamped weights. No personal scales, no eyeballing it. A merchant can sell at any price, but the weight must be accurate. Anyone who violates this rule loses their market stall for a month. The merchants grumbled. One said his scales were more accurate than any weights. Daniel suggested they check. They weighed a sack of grain on the merchant's scales and on the new weights. The difference turned out to be 14%, not in the buyer's favor. The merchant blushed and fell silent. The others accepted the rule without argument. Daniel asked Alvin to do one more thing: a board. A large wooden board at the market entrance. Every morning, the prices of basic goods would be written on it in chalk. Flour, salt, turnips, fish, coal. The buyer sees the price before approaching the counter. The merchant cannot quote one price to the rich and another to the poor. Alvin said that no one had ever done this before. Daniel said that was exactly why he was doing it. The board was put up 2 days later. That morning, Daniel himself wrote the first prices on it himself. The chalk crumbled, and the letters came out crooked. Merritt stood nearby and watched. She couldn't read but knew numbers. She saw the price for turnips: 15 copper coins per bunch. And next to it, the price in the capital: 35 copper coins. It was the first time she'd seen these numbers side by side. For the first time, she understood how much her labor was actually worth, and how much went toward travel expenses. Transparency. Daniel knew that word all too well. In his past life, it had been a trendy, empty buzzword. Here, it was a revolution. By the middle of the second month, there were 28 stalls at the Lowmark market. 13 new ones in 4 weeks. 3 merchants had arrived from neighboring provinces. One of them was a portly man named Bertram who sold spices. He'd come because he'd heard about the price board. He told Daniel it was brilliant. Buyers see the prices and aren't afraid of being cheated. That means they buy more. That means the merchant earns more even with a smaller margin. Daniel nodded. Bertram was the first person in the world to grasp the principle without needing an explanation. Daniel took note of him. People like that come in handy. By this time, Alvin had already filled half of his little notebook. He was writing down every new word Daniel used: cash flow, backloading, break-even point, wholesale discount, fixed price. One evening, Daniel caught him writing. Alvin was sitting by candlelight, carefully copying his notes onto separate sheets of paper. Daniel asked why. Alvin blushed. He confessed that the steward of the neighboring barony had sent a man who asked for a copy of the notebook in exchange for a silver coin. Daniel was silent for 5 seconds. Then he laughed so loudly that the guard at the door peeked in to check if everything was all right. He laughed for a long time, until he was in tears. Alvin stood there, red-faced, waiting for his punishment. Daniel said there would be no punishment. He told Alvin to keep selling copies, and he raised the price to 2 silver coins. Alvin opened his mouth to speak. Daniel explained, "Every governor who buys this booklet will try to do the same thing. Some will copy it incorrectly and fail, but others will copy it correctly, and their province will become richer. And then that province would need a trading partner." Who would be the first candidate? Lowmark, because Lowmark was the first. Alvin slowly sank into a chair. He said that the Lord thinks like a chess player. Daniel replied that he doesn't. He thinks like a logistics expert. A chess player plays to defeat his opponent. A logistics expert plays to ensure everyone arrives on time. It was the end of the second month. There were 28 stalls at the market. The treasury held 14 silver coins. The road from West Hall to the market was finished. Work had begun on the second section, from the market to the pass. 3 caravans had set out for Cont Almore and returned with a profit. Bran forged 30 crowbars and sold 10 to a neighboring village for full-weight silver. Merritt earned more in 2 months than she had in the previous 5 years. And locked away in ancient niches lay goods worth 40 silver coins, documented in receipts. The small, impoverished province was beginning to breathe. In the third month, Daniel solved 2 problems at once: the inn and the treasury. He had conceived the idea for the inn as early as his first trip, a spot at the fork in the road between Lowmark and the pass. A spring, a grove, a level clearing, the perfect location. Any caravan coming from Cant Almore would have to pass through it. The problem was labor. Daniel couldn't take people off the road. The road was more important. He found another way. In the village of Hazelmere lived 2 brothers who were carpenters. One of them was the very same man who, according to Alvin, drank more than he built. His name was Rory. The other was named Cade. Daniel went to see them in person. Rory was indeed drunk at 10 in the morning. Cade sat next to him, sober and angry. Daniel addressed Cade. He offered a contract to build a structure at the fork in the road in 6 weeks. Payment would be in warehouse receipts, plus 5% of the yard's first-year profits. Cade listened. Then he looked at his brother, then back at Daniel. He said he'd build it in 4 weeks if he were given 3 assistants and decent tools. And if his brother didn't meddle. Daniel shook his hand. Rory woke up late in the afternoon and discovered that his brother had left to build an inn for the Lord. 3 days later, Rory arrived at the construction site sober and silently picked up an axe. Cade said nothing. They worked side by side, in silence. It was more than just a contract. The second task was more complicated. Daniel needed someone who could do the math better than he could. He himself could keep track of dozens of routes and cash flows in his head. But bookkeeping was different. It required precision down to the last penny. It meant balancing expenses against income every day. It was a job that required someone with a certain mindset. Alvin was loyal but slow at calculations. Daniel searched for 3 weeks. He asked every merchant who came to the market, "Do you know anyone who's good with numbers?" Everyone shook their heads. Then Bertram, the spice merchant, remembered. He said that in the town of Hartwell, a 2-day journey from Lowmark, lived the daughter of a bankrupt merchant. She's smart. She can count faster than any money changer. But she has a bad reputation. Her father was ruined by forged promissory notes, and now no one wants to deal with the Karsten family. Daniel asked what her name was. Bertram said, "Evelyn." Daniel set off for Hartwell the next day. The town turned out to be small and dirty. Daniel found the Karstens' house on the outskirts. It was a 2-story stone house that had once been grand, but now stood with boarded-up windows on the second floor. Smoke was coming out of the chimney. That meant someone lived there. Daniel knocked. A 26-year-old woman opened the door. She was wearing a dark dress. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun. Her face was stern and pale. Her eyes were dark and watchful. She looked down at Daniel, even though she was half a head shorter than him. It was a talent. Daniel introduced himself. He said he was Lord Lowmark. Evelyn Karsten's expression didn't change. She said she neither bought nor sold, and she began to close the door. Daniel said he hadn't come to buy or sell. He'd come to offer her a job. Evelyn paused. She said she didn't trust merchants. Daniel said he wasn't a merchant. He was a lord. Evelyn said lords were even worse. Daniel smirked. He took the Lowmark ledger out of his bag, the very one in which Alvin had kept his records, and handed it to Evelyn. He said he was laying everything out for her to see. All income, all expenses, every penny. If she found a mistake or any deception, she should speak up. Evelyn took the ledger. She didn't invite him inside. She stood in the doorway and flipped through the pages. Daniel waited. 10 minutes passed. Evelyn looked up. She said there were no errors, but the bookkeeping was a mess. Entries were duplicated. There was no distinction between fixed and variable expenses. There's no depreciation accounting for tools. The crowbars made by Blacksmith brand wear out, and their cost needs to be allocated month by month rather than written off all at once. Daniel looked at her and felt what a person feels when they've been looking for a screwdriver for 3 weeks and finally found it. He said that was exactly why he needed her. Evelyn asked how much he was paying. Daniel named the amount. 5 silver coins a month plus lodging in the castle. Evelyn said that wasn't enough. Daniel said fine, 7 silver coins. Evelyn said it wasn't about the amount. She said she wanted one thing, access to the book. Permanent. Complete. No restrictions. If the Lord ever denied her access to the book, she would leave that very day. Daniel looked her in the eyes. He said he wouldn't just give her access. He would give her the only key. The book would be kept in the treasury room. Only she would have the key. Even the Lord himself would have to ask permission to look at it. Evelyn was silent for a long time. Something in her face had changed. Not her expression, something deeper. She said she would arrive in 3 days. Daniel nodded and left. 3 days later, Evelyn Karsten arrived in Lowmark with a single trunk of clothes and 2 trunks of account books. She entered the castle, looked around the treasurer's office, and said there was no window here. Olvin said that a treasurer's wasn't supposed to have a window. Evelyn said that this treasurer was entitled to one. By evening, Bran had knocked a hole in the wall and set a wooden frame in it. There was no glass, but there was the sky. Evelyn sat down at the desk, laid out the books, and began to work. She didn't leave the office until midnight. In the morning, Daniel found 3 sheets of paper on his desk. The first sheet contained Lowmark's complete balance sheet, income, expenses, and balance, all in one place. The second sheet was a list of receipts, to whom it was issued, for what amount, what it was backed by, when it was due. The third sheet contained a note. Evelyn wrote that the promissory note system was working but was fragile. If even one major holder of a promissory note came to the castle and demanded the goods, and there were no goods to be found, the entire system would collapse within a day. A reserve was needed. At least 20% of the total value of all issued promissory notes must be held in the warehouse as actual inventory. Always. No exceptions. Daniel read the note. Then he read it again. Then he stood up and walked over to Evelyn. She was sitting at the table, counting. He told her she was right, and that 20% was the minimum. He wanted 30. Evelyn looked up. She looked at him with an expression Daniel couldn't read. Then she said that 30 was fine, and she went back to the numbers. With Evelyn's arrival, everything had changed. Not on the outside, inside. The system that Daniel had been building intuitively and on the fly now had precise measurements. Evelyn saw the numbers the way Daniel saw routes. To her, every receipt was a living organism with a date of birth and a lifespan. She started a separate ledger for receipts, a separate one for caravan expenses, a separate one for construction. She could calculate in her head faster than Daniel could formulate a question. Once he asked her how much it would cost to build a second inn if the first had cost 8 silver pieces. Evelyn answered without looking up. 6 1/4. Because we already have the crowbars. Because Cade works faster now that he has experience. Because the road to the second location is shorter. Daniel stood in the doorway and thought that if he'd had a CFO like that in his past life, he wouldn't have fallen asleep at the wheel on the Singapore highway. Because that CFO wouldn't have sent him on a 3rd business trip in a row without a break. The Grey Heather Inn opened in the 4th week of the 3rd month. Cade built it in 26 days. A single-story stone building with 6 rooms, a stable for 4 horses, a kitchen, a well in the courtyard, a wooden sign with prices hung by the entrance, a room for the night, dinner, breakfast, water for the horse. Everything was fixed. Everything was written down. No inn on the continent posted its prices at the entrance. A traveler would only find out the price once he'd already sat down at the table and eaten half his dinner. Then the innkeeper would name any figure, and there was nowhere to run. Here, everything was different. The first guest at Grey Heather was a cart driver named Nash from Cont Almore. He was hauling fabric north. He saw the price board at the entrance. He stopped. He read it. He reread it. Then he went inside and asked if it was true. He was told it was true. He had dinner, spent the night, and paid exactly the amount listed on the board. In the morning, before leaving, he found the innkeeper and said he would tell every cart driver he met about this place. Within 2 weeks, 3 caravans a week were stopping at Grey Heather. A month later, 5. The carters were telling each other about it. A place where prices are fair. A place where you won't be cheated. A place where horses are given clean water to drink, not water from a puddle. Rumors traveled faster than caravans. Daniel sat in his office that evening, looking at the figures Evelyn had placed on his desk. In its 3rd month, Lowmark had earned 21 silver coins in net profit. The travel expenses had paid for themselves. The inn had turned a profit in just 3 weeks. The caravan route was operating steadily. Receipts circulated like cash, and no one had come to demand their goods early. The inventory reserve stood at 32%. Evelyn stood by the table and waited. Daniel looked up and said one word. "Good." Evelyn nodded. And for the first time since her arrival, she smiled. Not broadly, but barely, just the corner of her lips. But Alvin, who was standing in the doorway, later talked about that smile for 2 weeks straight to anyone who would listen. By the 4th month, the first problems from outside began to surface. Daniel had been expecting them. He knew that any success attracts attention. In Lagos, his warehouse was shot up 3 weeks after it opened. In Yangon, local officials demanded a kickback in the 2nd month. Here, it took a little longer. But it came. The first was Baron Trevor Dane, a minor lord whose lands lay south of Lowmark, between the province and the pass to Cant Almore. The only road to the capital ran through his territory, 3 miles of his land. Baron Dane set up a roadblock on the road. 2 logs and 4 soldiers. A toll for passage. 5 copper coins per wagon, 10 from a caravan. Gareth brought the news on the 4th day of the 4th month. He said the caravan to Count Almor had been detained. Dane's soldiers wouldn't let anyone through without payment. Daniel was sitting in his study with Evelyn. She looked up from her books and asked how much it would cost. Daniel quickly did the math. 5 caravans a month, 10 copper coins each. That's 50 copper coins. A little more than a silver coin, not much. But the problem wasn't the money. The problem in the precedent. If Dane can put up a barrier, then tomorrow every petty lord at every crossroads will do the same. The route Daniel had been building would collapse. Not because of a single barrier, but because of 20, 1,000 cuts. Daniel refused to pay. He refused to fight. He went to see Baron Dane in person. Dane's castle was twice the size of Lomark Castle, but 3 times as run down. The roof was leaking. The walls were blackened by damp. Skinny chickens roamed the courtyard. The Baron met him in a hall with a fireplace that wasn't lit. Trevor Dane was a man in his 50s with a military bearing and weary eyes. He wasn't a bad man. He was a ruined man. His lands yielded no income. His peasants were fleeing north. The toll gate was an act of desperation, not greed. Daniel saw this at once. He didn't bring up the tolls. He stepped up to the Baron and asked one thing. "What grows on your lands?" Dane smiled. He said, "Stone, stone and thorns." Daniel nodded. He asked what kind of rock. Dane didn't understand the question. Daniel explained, "There are different kinds of rock. Limestone, granite, shale, claystone, sandstone. Each is useful in its own way." Dane shrugged. He said he had no idea. Rock is just rock. Daniel asked to see for himself. They drove out to the hills together. Daniel wasn't a geologist, but he'd spent 10 years working on warehouses and roads. He knew which stone was suitable for foundations, which for paving, and which for walls. The stone on Dane's land turned out to be excellent building limestone, dense and easy to split along the layers. It held up well under weight. In his past life, stone like this had been hauled hundreds of kilometers to clad warehouses. Here, it lay right on the surface, for free. Daniel turned to Dane and proposed a deal. He said that Lomark needed stone, a lot of stone, for roads, inns, and warehouses. He was willing to buy the stone from Dane at a fixed price, a 1-year contract. The volume was guaranteed. Dane would hire his peasants to quarry the stone. He pays them with Lomark's money. His people get jobs. His land generates income. The barrier is removed. The road is open to everyone. Dane thought about it for a long time. He walked up and down the hill kicking stones. Then he stopped and said it sounded like a bribe. Daniel said it wasn't. A bribe is when you pay for nothing. He's paying for the stone. The stone is real. The work is real. The money is real. The only thing that isn't real is the barrier. Because the barrier doesn't create value. It only redistributes someone else's. Dane looked at him for a long time. Then he held out his hand. The barrier was removed the next day. A week later, 10 of Dane's peasants began breaking up the stone and hauling it to Lomark. 2 weeks later, Dane himself came to Lomark to check out the market. He stood by the price board for 10 minutes. Then he approached Daniel and said he wanted one just like it for his own town. Daniel said he'd make one. For free. Dane raised an eyebrow. Daniel explained that every market with a price board is a market people are more likely to visit. And every market people are more likely to visit is a market that caravans pass by. The road past Dane's market was the same road that ran through Lomark. 2 honest markets on the same route are better than one. Dane rode off in silence. But a month later, there was a price board in his town square, along with Lomark-style stamped weights. He was the first lord outside of Lomark to voluntarily adopt Daniel's system. The second problem of the 4th month was more serious. The captain of Lomark's castle guard. 12 soldiers. Their commander's name was Gregor Thorne. No relation to the mayor, just a coincidence of names. Gregor was a burly man of 35 with a square jaw and a grudge against the whole world. He had served in the previous lord's guard and expected the new lord to finally allocate funds for weapons and armor. Instead, the new lord spent everything on roads and warehouses. Gregor came to see Daniel on the 5th day of the 4th month. He laid his sword on the table. The scabbard was worn. The hilt was wrapped in leather over a crack. Gregor said that this sword could not protect the lord, that his men wore chainmail from which the links were falling off, that the shields were rotting, that the spears were blunt, that if someone came with weapons tomorrow, they wouldn't last even an hour. Daniel listened. He knew Gregor was right. Security was their weak point. It was his only weak point for which he had no answer from his past life. He didn't know much about weapons. He didn't know how much good chainmail cost. He didn't understand the tactics of defending a castle. Daniel told Gregor the truth. He said there was no money for rearmament, not yet. But there would be in 2 months, and then Gregor would get everything he asked for. New swords, new chainmail, new shields. Gregor asked why he should believe him. Daniel showed him Evelyn's book. The numbers. Revenue for the past 3 months. The forecast for the next 3. The growth curve. Gregor looked at the numbers as if they were a foreign language. He didn't understand. But he saw one thing. The numbers were growing. Every month, more than the one before. Daniel said that in 2 months, there would be enough in the treasury to order 12 new swords from the best blacksmith in Kant Almor, and 6 sets of chainmail. And that Bran was already learning to make spearheads that wouldn't dull. Gregor picked up his sword from the table. He said he'd give them 2 months, not a day more. And he left. Daniel slumped back in his chair. He knew that 2 months wasn't enough. He knew that chainmail was expensive. He knew that Gregor would leave if he didn't get what he was promised. And if Gregor left, 12 soldiers would go with him. And then Lomark would be left defenseless. Evelyn walked in a minute later. She had heard the conversation. She placed a sheet of paper on the table. It contained the calculations. If they increased the number of caravans to 7 per month and opened a second inn by the 6th month, they could raise the funds for rearmament by the deadline. But that meant all available funds would go toward expansion. Nothing for reserves. Nothing for unforeseen expenses. Daniel looked at the numbers, then at Evelyn. He asked what she thought. Evelyn said it was a risk. Daniel said he knew. Then he said that, in his experience, the biggest risk is not taking a risk when you need to. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. She said she'd write that down in Alvin's book. Daniel laughed. It was the first time Evelyn had made a joke. By the 5th month, construction of the second inn had begun. The site was chosen on the road north of Lomark toward Villard, a spot by the river. The bridge across the river was the only crossing for 20 miles. Cade was building again. Rory was helping. This time, he'd been sober from day 1. At the same time, Daniel was working on the Moss Bridge problem. The well. He remembered. Agnes had said the water had run dry 2 years ago. The women walked 3 miles to the stream. Daniel wasn't a water engineer. But he knew one principle. Water doesn't just disappear. It flows away. If the well has run dry, it means the aquifer has shifted or the water table has dropped. You have to dig deeper or in a different spot. He arrived in Mossbridge with Bran and 2 shovels. They inspected the old well. Then they walked around the surrounding area. Daniel was looking for signs he remembered from his course on warehouse location in arid regions. The vegetation was denser in one spot than elsewhere. The ground was moister in a low-lying area, a rock with a layer of clay. He found a spot 300 paces from the village, a low-lying area between 2 hills. The grass was greener there. He told them to dig. They dug for 4 days. On the 5th day, at a depth of 2 man-heights, they struck water. Clear, cold. Agnes stood at the edge of the pit and looked down. Then she sat down on the ground and covered her face with her hands. She wasn't crying. She just sat there, breathing. 2 women from the village came over and sat down beside her. They, too, were silent. Daniel stood off to the side, covered in mud, and felt something warm rising in his chest. He knew that feeling. He'd felt it in Mombasa when the first truckload of clean water arrived in the village that had been living on imported water for 3 months. He'd felt it in Dhaka when the rice warehouse began operating and the price of rice had dropped by half. It was a feeling that no amount of money could buy. The feeling that your work has meaning. On the way back, Daniel was silent. Bran was silent too. Then Bran said one thing. He said that the Lord was strange. Daniel asked why. Bran said that normal lords don't dig wells. Daniel replied that normal lords aren't needed. Bran grunted. But the next morning, he came to the castle without a commission. He just showed up. He sat down by the door to the office and waited. When Daniel came out, Bran said he wanted to stay. Not as a contractor, as Lomark's blacksmith, on permanent staff. Daniel nodded. They didn't sign a contract. For the first time in Lomark, someone stayed not because of a piece of paper but for else. By the middle of the 5th month, Lomark looked different than it had 5 months earlier. The road from Westhall to the pass was completely finished. 7 miles of smooth stone. 2 inns were in operation, Grey Heather on the southern road and the new river bridge on the northern one. There were 41 stalls at the market. 4 caravans a month traveled to Cont Almore, 2 to Wallard. There were 38 silver coins in the treasury. Receipts came in steadily. The reserve in the warehouse never fell below 28%. Evelyn kept a hawk's eye watch over all this. Gregor received 6 new swords, not 12, but 6, made of fine Cont Almore steel. The remaining 6 would arrive in a month. Gregor didn't smile when he received the swords, but he stopped placing his sword on the Lord's table. That was enough. Priest Cedric opened an orphanage. 3 orphans from neighboring villages were already living at the temple. Mariel Voss hadn't shown up yet. But Cedric was already complaining that he needed a healer, that the children were sick, that Merritt's herbs helped, but a real healer would be better. Daniel listened and took it all in. Every problem is the seed of a solution. Every solution is a new connection. Every connection makes the system stronger. On the evening of the 5th month, Daniel went down to the castle's basement alone, carrying an oil lamp. He walked past niches filled with marsh root and sacks of flour, past the shelves holding Evelyn's receipts and books, all the way to the far wall, to the archway leading into the darkness. He raised the lamp and stepped inside. The corridor led downward. The walls were smooth, polished. Not rough stone, but even blocks fitted so tightly together that not even a knife blade could be slipped between them. Daniel walked for 5 minutes. The corridor widened. A hall opened up before him. It was enormous. The ceiling was lost in the darkness. Rows of stone shelves, exactly like the ones upstairs, stretched along the walls. But there were hundreds of them. Thousands. This hall could hold enough supplies for an entire army. In the center of the hall stood a stone table. On the table lay a stone tablet covered in 3 centuries' worth of dust. Daniel set the lamp on the table and carefully brushed away the dust. Lines were carved into the tablet. A diagram, arrows, nodes, flows. Daniel stared at the diagram and felt the hairs on his arms stand on end. He had seen this diagram before. Not here. On his desk in his office upstairs. He had drawn one exactly like it himself 3 months ago. A flowchart. The 6th month began with rain that fell non-stop for 4 days. The road to the pass had become muddy in 2 places. The stone held, but the joints between the slabs had shifted. Daniel stood under the awning at Grey Heather and watched as the water carried clay along the roadside. He wasn't thinking about the rain. He was thinking about the plaque in the dungeon. For 4 nights in a row, he had returned to it in his mind. The diagram on the stone matched his own at 6 out of 8 key points. He hadn't marked the remaining 2 nodes because he didn't know the territory to the east. But whoever had drawn it 300 years ago did, and had placed the points exactly where Daniel would have placed them if he'd had the data. It was an impossible coincidence. Or perhaps not a coincidence at all. The rain stopped on the 5th day. Daniel returned to work. The second inn, River Bridge, on the northern road welcomed its first guests. Cade finished construction 2 days ahead of schedule. Rory whitewashed the walls and carved the Lowmark symbol on the lintel. Boo L in a circle. The same symbol that appeared on the weights and receipts. Daniel hadn't asked him to do it. Rory did it on his own. A small symbol, but an important one. People were beginning to identify with Lowmark, not because they were forced to, because Lowmark had become something they wanted to belong to. Evelyn balanced the books for the 5th month. 38 silver coins in the treasury. The debt to Bran was paid off. The debt to Cade was paid off. All promissory notes were secured at 31%. The caravan route was bringing in a steady income. But Evelyn pointed out a problem. She said that growth had slowed. For the first 3 months, revenue had doubled every month. Now it was growing by 20%. That was still growth. But the curve was leveling off. Daniel nodded. He knew that word, plateau. Every hub he'd built in his past life had gone through this phase. The initial surge fueled by enthusiasm and novelty. Then a slowdown. Then a new impetus was needed. A new product, a new route, a new market. He told Evelyn it was time to expand. Not roads, not yards. The product line. Lowmark was shipping marsh root and flour. That wasn't enough. They needed goods that traveled in the opposite direction. They needed goods that passed through Lowmark in transit. They needed to become not just a supplier, but a transshipment hub. A hub through which other people's cargo passes. A fee is charged for storage and handling of transit cargo. The margin is small, but the volume is large. Evelyn listened and took notes. Then she looked up and asked where Daniel planned to get the transit cargo. Daniel said the cargo was already there. It was simply passing through. Caravans traveling from Villard to Kant Almor took the long route through the Harton Pass. A 12-day journey. Via Lomark, it would be 8. But the caravans didn't know that route. Or perhaps they knew it but didn't trust it. A small, impoverished province. Rutted roads, no security, no warehouses. Why take the risk? Now there were roads. There were warehouses. There were inns. Only one thing was missing: guards. And that's when Daniel returned to Gregor. The captain had received 6 swords and was waiting for the remaining 6. Daniel came to him with another proposal. He said he would provide not 6 swords, but 24. Not 12 suits of chainmail, but 24. But in return, Gregor would double the guard. 12 new soldiers, and 4 of them would constantly patrol the road from Grey Heather to River Bridge, to guard the route. Gregor asked where he could find 12 soldiers. Daniel said he'd recruit them from the villages, young men with nothing to do who are currently either drinking or leaving to find work in other provinces. Give them uniforms, weapons, a salary, and a purpose. Gregor said that village lads aren't soldiers. Daniel said that no one is born a soldier. You become a soldier when you have something to defend. Gregor looked at him for a long time. Then he said he'd give it a try. But if even one of the recruits ran away in the very first skirmish, he'd personally drag him back by the ear. Daniel said that was fair. Recruitment began a week later. There weren't 12, but 19. Gregor selected 14. 26 soldiers, a small army. Ridiculous by the standards of any kingdom, but enough to patrol 20 miles of road and scare off petty bandits. And then another event occurred that Daniel hadn't planned for. In the 6th week of the 6th month, a caravan from Vellard arrived in Lomark. Not a small one, 12 wagons, 30 guards, a cargo of cloth and iron. The caravan was headed for Kant Almor via the Harton Pass, but one of the drivers had heard about Lomark, about fair prices, about inns with prices posted on a board, about a road that saves 4 days. A caravan leader named Oswald decided to give it a try. He veered off the main route and led the caravan through Lomark. Oswald was a large man with a black beard and a voice that could be heard from the other end of the market. He rode into Lomark in the lead wagon, and the first thing he saw was the price board. He stopped the caravan. He climbed down from the wagon. He walked up to the board. He read it. Then he turned to his men and said one word. Finally. Oswald's caravan stopped in Lomark for 2 days. The men rested. The horses drank their fill. The wagons were inspected and patched up. The blacksmith Bran replaced 2 broken rims in half a day. The wagon drivers ate at the tavern by the market and paid exactly what was written on the board. Not a penny more. Oswald came to see Daniel on the evening of the first day. He said he'd been leading caravans for 20 years. He'd passed through 100 towns and 1,000 inns. Nowhere and never had prices been posted in advance. Nowhere and never had a blacksmith repaired a rim at a fair price without haggling or threats. Nowhere and never had stamped weights been displayed at the market. He said he would tell every caravan driver from Vellard to North Hog about Lomark. Daniel poured him some tea and said he would be glad to see them all. Oswald left 2 days later. He left 30 silver coins in Lomark for lodging, food, repairs, and supplies. 30 silver coins for 2 days. That was as much as Lomark earned in a month. Evelyn looked at the numbers and, for the first time in all her years on the job, asked for a recount. She couldn't believe it. She recounted them herself. The numbers matched. Daniel was sitting in his office, looking out the window. He watched as Oswald's last wagon disappeared behind the hill. And he thought about how he, too, had known this moment. He'd seen it in Dubai when the first container ship entered the new port. He'd seen it in Singapore when the first flight landed on the new runway. The moment when the system ceases to be a project and becomes a reality. When the first major client comes on their own, without an invitation, without any persuasion, simply because it was in his best interest. That was the turning point. Before Oswald, Lomark had been an experiment. After Oswald, it became a route. But with the route came attention. 2 weeks after Oswald's departure, a man in a traveling cloak bearing the coat of arms of the Kant Almor Trade Guild arrived in Lomark. He didn't go to the market. He didn't stop at the Grey Heather. He went up to the castle and asked for an audience with the lord. His name was Ferris Blackwood. He introduced himself as the assistant to the guildmaster. He was polite. He smiled. He spoke softly. And with every word he spoke, Daniel's stomach knotted. Ferris said that the Kant Almore Guild had taken note of Lomark's successes. He said it was impressive. A small province. A young lord. Interesting ideas. The guild values initiative. The guild respects trade. The guild would like to propose a partnership. Daniel listened. He knew what partnership meant coming from the mouth of a man representing a monopoly. He'd seen it in Lagos when the Port Corporation offered cooperation to small carriers. Cooperation meant one thing. We take control. You get a percentage. If you refuse, we'll crush you. Ferris didn't make threats. He simply placed a sheet of paper on the table. A proposal. The Kant Almore Guild is ready to invest in Lomark. 500 silver coins. New roads, new warehouses, new caravans. In return, the guild would receive exclusive rights to transit through Lomark. All caravans passing through the province would pay a toll to the guild. Lomark would receive 20% of the tolls. Daniel read the paper. Then he put it back on the table. He said he'd think about it. Ferris smiled and said, "Of course. The Lord has 2 weeks. The guild is patient." Ferris left that same day. Daniel sat in his office until late at night. Evelyn was sitting across from him. She read the proposal 3 times. Then she said that, mathematically, it was profitable. 500 silver pieces was more than Lomark would earn in the coming year. 20% of transit fees is a stable, risk-free income. Daniel shook his head. He said it wasn't about the math. It was about control. If the guild obtained exclusive rights to transit, Lomark would cease to be a free crossroads. It would become a Kant customs post, Almore. Caravans from Vellard will stop passing through the guild's territory. Caravans from Northern Hog even more so. The short route through Lomark will die out again, and within a year, the guild will buy up the entire province for pennies. Evelyn was silent. Then she said she understood, and she asked what would happen if he refused. Daniel said that then the guild would move on to Plan B. He didn't know exactly what Plan B was, but he knew there would be one, because monopolists don't take no for an answer. They accept delays. Daniel turned down Ferris in a letter a week later. The letter was polite. He thanked him for the offer. He wrote that Lomark valued its friendship with the guild, but the principle of open transit was the foundation of the province's trade policy and could not be the subject of exclusive agreements. He offered an alternative. The guild could use the route through Lomark on the same terms as everyone else. Reduced duties, fair prices, safe roads. No preferential treatment, but no restrictions either. Ferris received the letter and left without saying goodbye. Daniel knew this was the beginning, not the end. The guild's response arrived 3 weeks later, not by letter, by poison. Daniel was sitting at dinner in the castle's great hall. Alvin, Evelyn, Gregor, Cade, Bran. They were eating a stew made of turnips and barley, a simple meal. Daniel raised his spoon to his mouth and paused. The smell, barely perceptible, bitter. He knew that smell, not of this world. In Lagos, one of his local partners had told him about the poisons they slip into competitors' food. Bitter almonds. Daniel set the spoon down on the table. He told everyone not to eat. His voice was calm, but his hands under the table clenched into fists. Alvin had already swallowed 3 spoonfuls. Daniel stood up and knocked his bowl onto the floor. Then he called for the cook, a woman named Nora. She swore she'd cooked everything as usual, the same ingredients, the same water. Daniel asked who had been in the kitchen today. Nora said it was just her and the boy who brings the firewood. Daniel asked what the boy looked like. Nora described him. Short, blonde hair. He came in the morning. He said the old woodcutter was sick and they'd sent him as a replacement. No one had seen this boy before. Gregor jumped up. He sent 2 soldiers to look for the boy. They didn't find him. Alvin was vomiting for half an hour. Merritt came from the village with some herbs. She gave him a decoction that made him vomit again, then another decoction that settled his stomach. By morning, Oven was alive but as pale as a wall. Merritt said the poison was weak, not lethal, more of a warning. If they'd wanted to kill him, they would have used more. Daniel stood by Olven's bed and looked at the man who had been writing down his every word in a little notebook since day 1. At the man who sold copies of those notes for silver and blushed like a schoolboy when he was caught. At the man who hadn't asked for a raise even once in 6 months. Daniel turned to Gregor and said that from this day forward, only trusted people would prepare food for the castle. 2 people, Nora and someone she would trust with her life. The food would be inspected. Water would be drawn only from the castle well. No one would enter the kitchen without Gregor's permission. Gregor nodded. He was angry, truly angry. Not at Daniel, at whoever dared to poison the food in his castle. It was an attack on his territory, on his honor. Daniel saw how Gregor had changed in that moment. Before, he had served because he was paid. Now he was guarding because it had become personal. The next day, Daniel convened a council. Evelyn, Gregor, Alvin, who insisted on getting out of bed, Bran, Cedric. Daniel said that the poison was a message from the Count Almora. Not proof. There is no proof. But logic points in only one direction. He had refused the guild 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks later, poison in the soup. A coincidence is possible, but unlikely. Gregor asked what to do. He couldn't attack the guild. 26 soldiers against a trading empire is suicide. Daniel said we didn't need to attack. We need to make sure the next assassination attempt costs more than the benefit of destroying Lomark, he explained. The guild sent the poison because Lomark is still small. Killing the lord of a small province is a minor operation. No one would notice. No one would investigate. But if Lomark became important to other people outside the province, if the caravanners from Villard depended on the route, if the healers of Cant Almor depended on marsh route, if Baron Dane depended on a contract for a pay, then an attempt on Lomark's life is an attempt on all those people's lives, and they'll look for someone to blame. Daniel said that the best defense isn't walls or swords. The best defense is when too many people have a stake in keeping you alive. Evelyn said that was a nice theory. But right now, Daniel is alive only because the poison was weak. Daniel agreed. He said he needed protection. Personal protection, not soldiers. Gregor's soldiers were needed on the road. He needed someone who would be by his side at all times. Someone who can fight better than any of the guards. Bran said he knew such a person. Everyone looked at the blacksmith. Bran rarely spoke, and when he did, it was to the point. If he opened his mouth, it meant it was worth hearing. He said that 2 months ago, a young woman had come into his smithy. She asked him to sharpen 2 short swords. Bran said the swords were unusual, Eastern-style forging, light, narrow, with wavy blades. They make swords like that in the distant kingdom of Hedon to the east. The woman paid without a word and left. Bran noticed the way she moved. He said that in his 20 years as a blacksmith, he'd learned to tell the difference between someone who carries a sword and someone who uses it. This woman used it. Daniel asked where to find her. Bran said she spent the night in the woods beyond the southern hill. She lives alone. She doesn't talk to anyone. She eats whatever she catches. Daniel rode to the southern hill that same day. He rode alone. Gregor protested. Evelyn said it was foolish. Daniel said that if a person lives alone in the woods and doesn't talk to anyone, they won't come out to meet a group of armed men. They'll come out to meet a single, unarmed person, or they won't come out at all. He found her camp in a clearing beyond the hill, a small shelter made of branches, a fire pit, 2 short swords stuck in the ground, hilt up. A woman was sitting on a rock, looking at him. Young, maybe 19, short-cropped black hair, a narrow face, high cheekbones, eyes dark and wary, like those of a beast deciding whether to flee or attack. Daniel stopped 10 paces away. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask her name. He sat down on the ground, crossing his legs, and said one sentence. He said he needed help. The woman didn't answer. She stared at him for 2 minutes without blinking. Daniel waited. Once in Dhaka, he'd negotiated with a riverboat captain who wouldn't speak to strangers. Daniel had sat on the dock for 4 hours before the captain spoke a single word. Patience was part of the job. The woman spoke after 5 minutes. She asked who he was. Daniel said he was Lord Lomark. The woman asked why he was alone. Daniel said he didn't want to scare her. The woman said she wasn't afraid. Daniel said he knew that. He said he was the one who was afraid. Yesterday, someone had tried to poison him, and he realized he didn't know how to defend himself. The woman was silent. Then she asked how much he was paying. Daniel said 3 silver coins a month, a room in the castle, food, and one thing that money can't buy, a place, not a night spent in the woods, a place where he could stay. The woman was silent for a long time. Daniel watched her fingers clench and unclench on her lap. She said her name was Hana Sojin, that she was from the Order of the Steel Moon on the East Coast, that she'd been expelled for disobeying an order, that she would kill him right now if he were armed, because an armed person is a threat. An unarmed person, she said, is either a fool or someone who has nothing to fear. Daniel said he was definitely a fool. Hannah didn't smile, but she stood up. She pulled the swords out of the ground, slung them over her back, and walked toward the road. Daniel followed her. They didn't speak the entire way to the castle. Hannah entered the castle and inspected every room, every corridor, every exit. Then she chose a room next to the door to Daniel's study. Not next to the bedroom, next to the study. Because Daniel spent 16 hours a day in his study and 4 in the bedroom. Hannah was protecting not the sleeping lord, but the working one. That was smart. On the first night, Daniel came out of his study at 2 in the morning and saw Hannah. She was sitting on the floor by his door, swords on her lap, eyes open. He told her she could sleep. She replied that she was sleeping, just with her eyes open. Daniel didn't argue. He went to the bedroom and, for the first time in a week, slept peacefully. The next day, Daniel was walking through the market and saw a new stall. A boy of about 12 was sitting behind it, selling wooden toys. Little horses, little dogs, little wagons. The work was rough but full of soul. Each figure was carved in its own unique way. Daniel bought a small carved fox for 2 copper coins. A beautiful one, with its tail raised and a sly face. He brought it to the castle and placed it on the table by the door to Hannah's room. No note, no words. He just set it down and left. The 7th month brought 2 events. One Daniel had planned. The other he hadn't. The first event, the standard contract form. Daniel spent 2 weeks drafting the document. 1 page, large print, simple words. A contract for the supply of goods. Seller's name, buyer's name, name of the goods, quantity, price, date, term, the Lowmark seal, the temple's blessing, 2 signatures or 2 crosses if no signature is provided, and 1 line at the bottom that changed everything. Any dispute regarding the contract shall be resolved by Lord Lowmark within 7 days. The Lord's decision is final and binding on both parties. Arbitration. Daniel knew that word. He knew that without it, contracts were meaningless. A piece of paper is worth nothing if there is no one to enforce it. In his past life, the courts played that role. Here there were no courts. There were lords. But the lords settled disputes in their own favor or in favor of whoever paid the most. Daniel proposed something different. He would settle disputes not in anyone's favor, but according to the contract. What was written would be the law. If a seller promised 10 sacks but delivered 8, he would pay a penalty. If a buyer promised silver but delivered copper, he would pay a penalty. No exceptions. Regardless of nobility or wealth, he announced this at the market on Saturday morning. 50 people stood in front of the price board. Daniel stood on a crate because he wasn't very tall and couldn't be seen over the stalls. He spoke simply. He said that starting that day, Lowmark would offer a standard contract, free of charge. Anyone could come to the castle and ask for a form. Anyone could enter into a deal using that form. And if anyone breached the contract, Lord Lowmark himself would deal with it. Quickly, fairly, by the book. The crowd fell silent. Bertram, the spice merchant, was the first to take a form. He read it, turned it over, read it again. Then he looked at Daniel and said it was the best thing he'd ever seen in his life. Because until that day, every contract had been nothing more than a promise, and everyone breaks promises. Now, behind the promise stood a seal and the law. Not some royal law that no one understands, but a simple, clear law on a single page. 11 contracts were signed in the first week, 23 in the second. Merchants from neighboring provinces came specifically for the forms. They concluded deals among themselves on Lowmark's territory so that any dispute could be settled by the lord they trusted. Trust. Daniel recalled the setting of this world every time he heard that word. Trust was the greatest scarcity, and he had found a way to create it. The first dispute arose 10 days later. A fish merchant from Hazelmere accused a grain merchant from Vallard of short delivery. The contract was for 5 sacks of wheat at the standard weight. The grain merchant had delivered 5 sacks, but each weighed a quarter less. Daniel reviewed the case in his office. Evelyn was present as a witness. Alvin took notes. Hannah stood by the door. Daniel weighed the sacks on calibrated scales. The short weight was confirmed. He handed down his ruling. The grain merchant was required to deliver the missing weight within 5 days, plus a penalty of 10% of the contract value. The grain merchant was angry. He claimed the grain had shrunk during transport. Daniel replied that shrinkage was the seller's risk, not the buyer's. The contract specified the weight. If the seller cannot guarantee the weight upon delivery, he must include a safety margin. The trader left cursing, but 5 days later, he delivered the missing grain and paid the penalty. And here's what happened next. A week later, the same grain merchant returned to Lowmark, not with a complaint, but with a new contract. He had struck a deal with another buyer. This time, the bags were full weight, with a buffer for shrinkage. Daniel realized that the system works not because it punishes, but because it teaches. A merchant who has paid a penalty once will never short weight again. Not out of fear, but out of calculation. Because the penalty is more expensive than an extra pound of grain. The second event of the 7th month was unplanned. A woman named Mariel Voss arrived in Lowmark on foot, with a knapsack slung over her shoulders, wearing a worn nun's cloak. She didn't come to see Daniel. She came to see Cedric, at the orphanage. 3 orphans had been suffering from a cough that hadn't gone away for 2 weeks. Cedric was rushing back and forth between the temple and the orphanage, not knowing what to do. Merritt's herbs helped with stomach aches and wounds, but not with a chest cough. Mariel entered the orphanage, examined the children in 10 minutes, and set to work. She took out of her knapsack little bags of herbs that Merritt had never seen before. She brewed a decoction that made the children cough even harder. Cedric was frightened. Mariel said that was exactly how it was supposed to be. Coughing brings up phlegm. By morning, the children were breathing freely. 3 days later, all 3 were healthy. On the 5th day, Cedric told Daniel about Mariel. He said she was a former nun and healer from the Order of the Bright Path. She left because she was forbidden from treating the poor for free. The order believed that healing was a gift from God and should be sold to finance the temples. Mariel thought otherwise. She left and has been traveling from village to village ever since, treating people in exchange for food. Daniel went to the shelter. Mariel was sitting on a bench, sorting through herbs. She was 31 years old, but she looked older. Her hands were chapped from the cold. Her face was weather-beaten. Her eyes were warm and weary. She looked up when he entered. Daniel sat down beside her. He said that Cedric had told him about her. Mariel said she wasn't asking for charity. She worked for food and a roof over her head. If the Lord wanted her to leave, she would leave. Daniel shook his head. He said he wanted the opposite. He wanted her to stay. Forever. He offered her a position. Lowmark's healer. The infirmary at the castle. Herbs paid for by the treasury. A room. A salary. And one condition that left her speechless. Free medical care for all residents of Lowmark. For everyone. No exceptions. Mariel stared at him for so long that Daniel began to doubt she'd heard him. Then she asked why. Why for free? Who pays for the herbs if not the patients? Daniel explained. He spoke slowly because it was important. He said that illness is a loss. Not for the sick person. For everyone. When Thorn is sick, the turnips aren't harvested. When Bran is sick, the haystacks aren't made. When the cart driver Gareth is sick, the caravan stands still. Every day of illness is lost income for the entire province. Mariel's herbs cost 3 copper coins a day. The lost income from a sick worker costs 20. Free treatment isn't charity. It's an investment. The most profitable investment the province can make. Mariel was silent. Then she said one sentence in a quiet voice. She said that in 20 years, Daniel was the first person who had told her that her work made sense. Not in a divine way. Not in a moral way. Practical. Measurable. Real. Daniel didn't know what to say. He just nodded. Mariel stood up and went to set up the infirmary. She chose a room on the first floor of the castle with 2 windows facing south. Bran installed the window frames. Cade knocked together 3 beds. Merritt brought all the herbs she'd gathered over the past month. Cedric brought the children from the orphanage in for their first checkup. By the end of the week, the infirmary was up and running. The first patient was one of Gregor's recruits who had cut his hand during training. Mariel stitched up the wound, cleaned it, and bandaged it in 10 minutes. The soldier walked out with his hand bandaged and his eyes wide. He told his comrades that his hand didn't hurt, that the nun had put something on it, and the pain was gone. By evening, 5 more people had come to the infirmary. A cough, a sore back, a rotten tooth. Mariel worked until midnight. In the morning, she went to Daniel and said she needed an assistant. Daniel said he'd find one. Mariel said she'd already found one. Merit. The old herbalist knows local plants better than any textbook. The only things she lacks are knowledge of anatomy and medical techniques. Mariel would teach her. Daniel agreed. Merritt came to the infirmary that same day. The two women, who had practiced medicine in different ways, hit it off within an hour. Merritt knew which root grew where and when to harvest it. Mariel knew what to do with that root and in what dosage. Together, they were better than any doctor in the capital. Daniel stood in the doorway of the infirmary and watched as Mariel showed Merritt how to make a compress. Two women. One, a former nun who had been expelled for her kindness. The other, an old herbalist who had been taken advantage of her whole life. Both had found in Lomark what they couldn't find anywhere else. A place where their work is worth exactly what it's worth. No more, no less. By the end of the 7th month, Lomark looked like this. The province's population had grown to 1,100 people. 120 had come from neighboring villages in search of work. There were 62 stalls at the market, 2 inns, 1 infirmary, 1 shelter, 26 soldiers, 1 treasurer who calculates faster than Daniel can think, 1 blacksmith who won't leave for any amount of money, 1 bodyguard who sleeps with his eyes open, 1 healer who treats patients for free and still turns a profit. There are 74 silver coins in the treasury. Receipts circulate as currency within the 2 provinces. Contracts are drawn up using a standard form. Disputes are resolved within a week, and every caravan that passes through Lomark tells the next caravan about it. The 8th month. For the first time, Daniel ventured beyond the borders of his province, not as a merchant, but as a lord. The neighboring Duke of Weimar, Alten, invited him to a reception. The invitation arrived via a messenger on parchment bearing a gold seal. Olven read it 3 times and said it was an honor. That Duke Alten ruled a territory 20 times larger than Lomark, that his court consisted of 300 people, that other lords would be there, barons, perhaps even someone from Valard's royal council. Daniel looked at his only decent suit. It had been remade from the previous lord's clothes and sat crookedly at the shoulders. He asked Olven what people wore to the Duke's reception. Olven said velvet, silk, gold embroidery, a fur collar, if the lord is wealthy enough. Daniel looked at the treasury, then at his suit, then at Evelyn. Evelyn said that if he spent money on clothes for just 1 evening, she would quit. Daniel went as he was. Hannah went with him. Gregor insisted on 4 soldiers as an escort. The journey to the Duke's castle took 2 days. The castle was enormous. Stone walls 10 men tall, towers with flags, a moat filled with water, a drawbridge, guards in polished armor. Carriages bearing coats of arms stood in the courtyard, horses in silver harnesses, servants in livery. Daniel stepped out of his battered carriage and felt as if he'd arrived at the Davos conference in a t-shirt and jeans. He knew that feeling. It was unpleasant but familiar. In Lagos, he had once negotiated with the Minister of Transportation in an office upholstered in gold fabric. Daniel was wearing dusty boots and a wrinkled shirt. The minister looked down on him, until Daniel showed him the cost-saving calculations for the route. Numbers don't wear velvet. The reception was held in a grand hall. Long tables. Silver platters. Musicians on the balcony. About 50 guests. Lords and barons and their wives in dresses that cost more than Lomark's annual budget. Daniel walked in and immediately realized he'd made a mistake. Not with his clothes, with his preparation. He didn't know the etiquette. He didn't know whom to bow to first. He didn't know which side to approach the Duke from. He didn't know which hand to use to raise his goblet. Every movement in that hall was a code, and he didn't know a single symbol. Alvin whispered hints in his ear. Bow after 3 steps. To the Duke first, then to his wife, then to the senior lords, moving clockwise. Daniel nodded and did as he was told, but he could feel the stares on him. Indulgent, curious, mocking. A young lord from a small province in a retailered dress. Duke Weimar Alten turned out to be a man of 60 with a gray beard and piercing eyes. He greeted Daniel briefly but without mockery. He said he'd heard interesting things about Lomark, that caravan drivers tell tall tales about a market where no one cheats, about a road where no one is robbed, about an inn where prices are written on a board. The Duke said he didn't believe the caravan drivers. They lie more often than fishermen. But when 10 caravan drivers all lie the same way, it's no longer a lie, it's a statistic. Daniel chuckled to himself. He said these weren't tall tales. It's a business model. The Duke didn't understand those last words. Behind Daniel's back, Alvin quietly jotted them down in a little notebook. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Daniel ate very little. He spoke even less. He observed a great deal. He saw how the lords talked, how they stood, how they drank, who was with whom, and who was against whom. 3 hours of observation told him more than a month of questioning. The lords were afraid. Every single one of them. They feared a war between the three kingdoms. They feared their provinces would end up on the front lines. They feared the caravans would stop coming and their lands would fall into poverty. Each of them sought safety. Some through alliances, some through weapons, some through marriage, none through trade. Daniel saw a niche, a huge, empty niche in which he stood alone. And that was when the second important event of the evening took place. He was standing by the wall with a goblet of wine he had barely touched. A woman approached him, young, about his age, black hair, dark eyes with a distinctive shape, skin the color of warm amber, dressed in a strangely cut gown, not Western but Eastern. The fabric bore a pattern Daniel had never seen before. Around her neck was a thin gold chain with a crane-shaped pendant. She approached and spoke in the local language with a soft accent. She said she'd noticed him watching, that most of the guests had come to show off, but he had come to observe. That was unusual for a lord. Daniel asked who she was. The woman said her name was Sora Che-yun, the daughter of the ambassador to Hedon. The former ambassador, because the government in Hedon had changed and she'd been forgotten. She'd been living at the Duke of Alton's court for 3 years now, as a guest, which actually meant as an exhibit. A beautiful Eastern woman paraded at receptions so that guests could see how generous and hospitable the Duke was. Daniel had heard 2 barons at the table discussing her accent and laughing. He saw how Sora heard them but didn't turn her head, how she kept her back straight and her chin steady, how she smiled that smile people who are used to humiliation tend to smile. Daniel didn't say anything comforting to her. He asked her about Hedon, specifically. With a notebook in hand, he asked what goods Hedon exported. Sora was surprised. Then she answered, silk, porcelain, spices, tea leaves, lacquerware, paper, ink, medical instruments. Daniel took notes. He asked which trade routes were used. Sora said by sea through the southern ports. It's long and expensive, 3 months one way. Daniel asked if there was a land route. Sora said that, theoretically, yes, through the eastern steppes and a mountain pass. But no one has traveled that way for 100 years. It's dangerous. Daniel wrote that down too. Then he looked up from his notebook and looked at Sora. She was standing there, looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. Then she said one thing. She said that in the 3 years she'd been at the Duke's court, not a single man had asked her opinion on a single matter. They'd discussed the weather and music with her. They'd paid her compliments on her skin and hair. Not a single one had pulled out a notebook. Daniel said that his notebook was his main weapon. Sora laughed. It was the first time in 3 years at a foreign court. Daniel could see it. It wasn't a polite laugh. It was a genuine laugh. She covered her mouth with her hand and for a second ceased to be an exhibit and became a 22-year-old woman who was tired of being a decoration. They talked for 2 hours. Daniel learned more about Hedon's trade from this conversation than from any other in the past 6 months. Sora knew 6 languages. She knew the customs rates for 5 ports. She knew which tea was prized in Villard and which in Cant Almore. She knew the names of merchants who had traveled the eastern route 50 years ago. This woman was a walking encyclopedia of Eastern trade, and for 3 years she had been used as a table ornament. Before leaving, Daniel approached Sora. He said that in 3 months there would be a big market day in Lowmark. He invited her, not as a guest, but as a consultant on Eastern trade. He was willing to pay. Sora looked at him for a long time. Then she said she would come, for free. Daniel left the Duke's castle the next morning. He remained silent in the carriage. Hannah sat across from him with swords on her lap. Alvin was asleep. Daniel was thinking. He was thinking about silk and porcelain, about the eastern route across the steppes, about how, if a route to the east were opened, Lowmark would cease to be merely a hub between 3 kingdoms. It would become a bridge between 2 worlds, the west and the east. And then its value would increase not 10-fold, but 100-fold. But first, he had to survive until that moment. Because the Kant Almor Guild had not forgotten his refusal, and the poison in the soup was only the beginning. The 9th month began with a knife. Not a metaphorical one, a real one. Daniel was riding back from Grey Heather. Hannah was riding 2 paces behind him. The road ran through a grove where the trees stood close to the roadside. Hannah shouted. Daniel didn't see anything. He heard a whistle and felt something brush past his neck. Hot. Close. Hannah was already on the ground. She moved so fast that Daniel didn't have time to realize how she'd gotten between him and the trees. 2 short swords in her hands. 3 figures emerged from behind the trees. Dark cloaks. Hoods. One of them had a crossbow. He was already reloading. Hannah threw one of her swords, not at a man but at the crossbow. The blade struck the stock and split the wood. The crossbow fell apart in the archer's hands. Hannah leaped forward. The first one fell a second later, a sweep to the legs followed by a blow with the hilt to the temple. The second one drew a knife. Hannah grabbed his arm, twisted it, and struck him in the throat with her elbow. The third one ran off. Hannah didn't chase after him. She returned to Daniel and stood beside him. Swords in hand, eyes on the trees. She waited. No one else came out. Daniel sat on his horse, realizing he'd just narrowly escaped death. The knife had passed within an inch of his throat. He saw a scratch on his collar. The fabric was torn in a straight line. His hands weren't shaking. Not because he was brave, because the adrenaline hadn't worn off yet. He'd start shaking later, at night, alone, in the dark. Hannah tied up the 2 attackers. Gregor picked them up an hour later. He interrogated them. Mercenaries from the suburbs of Kant Almor. They were paid 5 silver pieces each. They didn't know who paid them. A hooded man came into the tavern and put the money on the table. He said to kill Lord Lomark. Description, route, time. Someone knew when and where Daniel would be traveling. Someone inside Lomark passed on the information. Daniel sat in his office, staring at the wall. Evelyn sat across from him. Hannah stood by the door. Gregor stood by the window with his arms crossed. Traitor. That word hung in the air. Someone among Lord Lomark's people was working for the guild. Someone knew Daniel's schedule and sold it for silver. Gregor wanted to interrogate everyone. Every servant, every soldier, every market worker. Daniel said no. He said that a mass interrogation would destroy the trust he'd been building for 9 months. People would get scared. They'd start accusing each other. False accusations, paranoia. That's exactly what the guild wants. Not to kill Daniel, to destroy what he's built from within. Daniel said he'd find the traitor another way, through the system. He changed his schedule. He stopped taking the same route at the same time. A different route every day, different times, different escorts. And he told each member of his inner circle a different plan. He told Alvin he'd be heading north on Monday. To Gregory, he said he'd be heading south on Tuesday. To Bran, he said he'd be heading east on Wednesday. A different story for everyone, and he waited. Evelyn was the first to figure it out. She came into his office and said she recognized this method. She had read about it in old merchant chronicles. When a merchant suspected a leak, he would give each partner a unique piece of false information. Whichever partner leaked it would be the traitor. Daniel nodded. He said that in his world, it was called a canary. Evelyn didn't ask what a canary was. She jotted down the word and went back to work. The result came a week later. One of Gregor's new recruits, a guy named Tom, 19 years old, quiet, nervous. He'd come from the village over the hill 2 months ago. The information Daniel had passed on through Gregor ended up in the hands of a man who was waiting on the northern road. Hannah found him. The man was sitting by the roadside, waiting for the caravan that Daniel was supposedly supposed to be escorting. There was no caravan. Hannah brought the man who had been waiting to the castle. Under interrogation, he named Tom. Gregor was furious. He wanted to hang Tom from the castle gates. Daniel said no. He ordered that Tom be brought to his office. The young man was pale as a ghost. He was trembling. Daniel sat down across from him and asked why. Tom was silent for a minute. Then he spoke. His mother lived in the suburbs of Kant Almor. She was sick. The treatment cost money that Tom didn't have. A man came to him and said he'd pay 10 silver coins. All he had to do was tell him when and where the Lord was going. Nothing more. Tom didn't want anyone killed. He thought it was just surveillance. Daniel listened. Then he said one thing. He said he understood. Tom looked up. There was astonishment in his eyes. Daniel said that a mother is a mother, and that 10 silver coins was more than Tom had ever seen in his life, and that a man who offers money for a small favor always sounds reasonable, until it becomes clear that the favor cost someone their life. Tom began to cry. Daniel turned to Gregor. He said that Tom wouldn't be hanged. He would be transferred to road construction, 6 months of hard labor. Half of his wages would go to his mother. The other half would go to the treasury as compensation. In 6 months, if Gregor confirmed that Tom had worked honestly, he would be reinstated. Gregor said that was too lenient. Daniel said it was too harsh when an enemy got exactly what he wanted. A hanged traitor is fear. Fear is a crack. Cracks bring down walls. Gregor disagreed, but he complied. Tom left for road work the next day. In 3 months, he would become one of Lomark's most loyal citizens. But that would come later. For now, Daniel was tackling the next problem. The guild was ramping up the pressure. 2 caravans from Vellard that were passing through Lomark were intercepted as they approached the pass. They weren't robbed. They were turned back. Men in Count Almor Guild uniforms stood on the road and said the pass was closed for repairs. The caravans took the long route. There were no repairs being done on the pass. A blockade. A soft one. Unofficial, but effective. 2 caravans meant a loss of 20 silver pieces a week. In a month, that came to 70. In 2 months, the treasury will be empty. Daniel convened a council. Evelyn laid the figures on the table. With the current blockade, Lomark will go into the red in 6 weeks. Gregor proposed breaking through the blockade by force. 26 soldiers against 10 guild members. It's possible, but it would be an act of aggression. The guild would have grounds for an official complaint to King Count Almor, and then not 10 men would arrive, but 1,000. Daniel thought about it for 3 days. He didn't sleep. He paced around his office. He studied the map. And on the 4th day he found the answer. The northern route. Lomark had a road south to Count Almor through the pass. That road was blocked. But there was another road north to Wallard via Riverbridge. No one was blocking that road, because few goods traveled along it. Vellard bought mainly from its own suppliers. But Daniel remembered his conversation with Sora. Silk, tea, porcelain. Vellard didn't produce any of these goods. He bought them from Count Almor's middlemen at triple the price. If Lomark offered Vellard a direct channel to Eastern goods through him, if Daniel found a supplier of Eastern goods bypassing the guild, then the blockade of the southern route would cease to matter. The northern route would become the main one, and it would be Wallard, not Lomark, that the Count Almor Guild would lose. Daniel wrote a letter to Sora. He asked if she knew any merchants from Hedon who could deliver goods via the overland route. The reply came 10 days later. Sora wrote that she knew one. His name is Master Yoon. He lives in the border town of Kagon on the edge of the eastern steppes. He is the only merchant who still leads caravans along the old route. He is old and stubborn and won't negotiate with anyone. But he respects those who know Eastern etiquette. Sora wrote that she was ready to travel to Kagon as if Daniel entrusted her with the task. Daniel replied with a single word. I trust you. 3 days later, Sora set out from Duke Alton's castle, heading east. Accompanying her were 2 of Gregor's soldiers and the cart driver Gareth. They carried samples of Lomark's goods, marsh root, limestone, Brand's iron bars, and Daniel's letter to Master Yoon, in which he proposed a trade route through Lomark. The west receives silk. The east receives iron and stone. Lomark stands in the middle and takes 5%. Daniel sent Sora off and waited. The wait was difficult. The blockade continued. The treasury was dwindling. Every day, Evelyn laid out new figures on the table. They were getting worse. Gregor was on edge. The soldiers could feel the tension. Even Bran had become quieter than usual. Only Hannah was her usual self. She sat by the door, swords on her lap. Her eyes were open. A carved fox stood beside her. One night, Daniel left his office at 3 o'clock. He couldn't sleep. Hannah was sitting in her usual spot. Daniel sat down next to her on the floor. They were silent for 10 minutes. Then Hannah spoke a single sentence. She said that walls are stronger when they're built without haste. Cassian Morven received Daniel at his home in the capital, Count Almor. Not in the guild hall, in his private study. That alone spoke volumes. The guild hall was for show. The private study was for conversation. Morven's house stood on the capital's main street. 3 stories of white stone. Balconies with wrought iron railings. servants in matching uniforms. Everything was impeccable. Everything was expensive. Everything was well thought out. Cassian Morven turned out to be nothing like what Daniel had expected. He had expected a fat merchant with gold rings and a sycophantic smile. Instead, sitting before him was a thin man of 45 with closely cropped gray temples and calm gray eyes. He was dressed simply. A dark, unembellished doublet, no rings. His only adornment was a silver pin on his collar bearing the guild's crest. He offered Daniel some wine. Daniel declined. Cassian smiled wryly and said that was sensible, given the circumstances. Daniel appreciated the joke. A man who jokes about poison, which he may have ordered himself, is a man who isn't afraid to speak plainly. Daniel decided to speak plainly as well. He said he hadn't come to complain, not to bargain, nor to ask for anything. He had come to explain why the blockade of Lowmark was a mistake, not a moral one, but a mathematical one. Cassian leaned back in his chair and said he was listening. Daniel took out the papers, 3 sheets that Evelyn had prepared overnight. The first showed a map of trade flows through Lowmark over the past 9 months. The second was a calculation of the guild's losses from the blockade. The third was a forecast for the coming year. Daniel began with the numbers. He said that the blockade of the pass was costing the guild 12 silver pieces a day, 10 soldiers on the road, their pay, their food, the lost caravans that would have traveled through the pass and paid the guild's toll, but are now taking other routes. Caravans don't disappear when the road is closed. They find another route, and that other route pays the guild nothing. Cassian listened without interrupting. His expression remained unchanged. Daniel continued. He said that Lowmark isn't a competitor to the guild. Lowmark is a tool, a transit point that makes the route through Kant Almor faster and cheaper. Every caravan that passes through Lowmark eventually ends up in Kant Almor, via the pass, and pays the guild's toll in the capital. By blocking Lowmark, the guild is blocking its own flow. It's like damming a river that carries gold dust to your city. Cassian was silent for 10 seconds. Then he said the analogy was beautiful, but inaccurate. He said the problem wasn't the flow. The problem is control. The guild had controlled trade in Kant Almor for 300 years. Every caravan, every contract, every price. Lowmark creates an alternative. An alternative means a loss of control. A loss of control means a loss of power. And power is worth more than any flow of goods. Daniel nodded. He said he understood. And that was exactly why he was here. Not to take away control, but to offer a new form of control, one that was more profitable. Cassian raised an eyebrow. Daniel laid out the proposal. Lowmark would become a certified transit hub for the Kant Almor Guild. Not an exclusive one, an open one, but bearing the guild's seal. Every caravan passing through Lowmark receives the guild's seal of quality. The goods are inspected. The weight is verified. The contract is certified. This means the guild doesn't have to spend resources on inspections in the capital. Lowmark does it for them, free of charge. The guild saves time and money on inspections. It receives a steady stream of caravans that it cannot provide on its own. And most importantly, the guild seal is beginning to circulate beyond Kant Almor. In Villard, in Northern Hug, everywhere Lowmark's influence reaches. The guild's control isn't diminishing, it's growing. Just in a different way. Cassian sat motionless. His eyes never left Daniel's face. Then he did something Daniel hadn't expected. He laughed. Quietly, briefly, but sincerely. He said that in his 20 years at the head of the guild, hundreds of people had come to him. Lords, merchants, ambassadors. They all wanted the same thing, a piece of the pie. Daniel was the first to come and offer to make that piece bigger. Cassian rose from the table. He walked over to the window. He looked out onto the street. Then he turned and said he wanted to think it over. 3 days. Daniel said that 3 days was reasonable, and that while he was considering the matter, he asked that the blockade of the pass be lifted, as a gesture of goodwill. Cassian said the blockade would be lifted by this evening. They shook hands. The handshake was firm. Both sides knew this was not yet an alliance. It was a truce. But a truce was better than war. Daniel stepped out of Morwen's house and saw Hannah. She was standing by the horses, 2 swords on her back, eyes on the street. She had been waiting for 3 hours without moving an inch. Daniel mounted his horse, and they rode home. On the way, he thought about Cassian, about his eyes, about his laughter. This man wasn't a villain. He was the system. A machine that did what it was designed to do. It controlled. It protected the monopoly. It stifled competition. Not out of cruelty, but out of logic. The system had been in place for 300 years, and now a man had come along who proposed a different logic, one in which a monopoly wasn't necessary because an open market yielded greater profits. Cassian understood this. The question was whether he would accept it, or whether his pride and habit would prove stronger than mathematics. 3 days later, the answer arrived. A messenger brought a letter bearing the guild's silver seal. Cassian accepted the offer, with amendments. The guild would receive not just certification, but 10% of Lomark's transit fees. Daniel read it and agreed. 10% of a growing flow is more than 100% of zero. Evelyn read the terms and said it was a good deal. Not perfect, but good. Daniel signed it. The blockade was lifted. Caravans began passing through the pass. A week later, the first caravan bearing the guild seal passed through Lomark. The 10th month brought Sora back. She returned from the eastern steppes, tanned and thinner. A caravan of 7 camels arrived with her. Daniel had never seen camels in this world. Neither had the residents of Lomark. The entire market came out to watch. Children ran alongside the caravan. The elderly stood by the road and shook their heads. Bran came out of the smithy and stared at the camels in silence for 3 minutes. Then he said they had the wrong kind of horses. Sora brought 3 items. The first, 20 bales of Hedon silk, soft, lightweight, shimmering in the light so much that the weavers of Lomark touched it and couldn't stop. Second, a contract with Master Yoon. The old merchant agreed to a trial route. 1 caravan every 3 months. Silk and porcelain to the west, iron and stone to the east, Lomark in the middle. 5% transit fee. The third item was neither merchandise nor a contract. It was Master Yoon himself, a 70-year-old man with a white beard and eyes that had seen more roads than all the inhabitants of Lomark put together. He came in person because he didn't trust paperwork. He trusted only the people he saw with his own eyes. Master Yoon entered the castle, and the first thing he did was look at the ceiling, then at the walls, then at the floor, then at Daniel. He said through Sora, who was translating, that the castle was poor. Daniel said yes. Master Yoon said that was good. A rich castle means a greedy lord. A poor castle means a lord who invests in his business. They had lunch in the Great Hall. Master Yoon ate very little. He drank the tea he'd brought with him. He looked at everything. At Evelyn, who had brought the books. At Hannah, who was standing by the door. At Alvin, who was writing down every word. And at Gregor, who didn't understand why the old man had brought humpback horses. After lunch, Master Yoon asked to see the market. Daniel led him there personally. The old man walked slowly. He stopped at every stall. He touched the merchandise. He looked at the weights. He read the price board. He reached the end of the row and turned to Daniel. He said through Sora that in 50 years of trading, he had seen 1,000 markets. At every one, he'd been shortchanged. Here, every stall had identical stamped weights. The prices were written on the board. The contracts were just 1 page long. He said that was impossible. Daniel said it was possible, because it's more profitable than cheating. Master Yoon looked at him for a long time. Then he smiled. For the first time during the entire visit. He said his great-grandfather had told him about a place where trade was honest. 300 years ago. Here, in these hills. The Almea Empire. Daniel froze. Master Yoon continued. He said that in Hedon, they still remember Almea, not as a legend but as a fact. Almea was the world's trading hub. Everything passed through it: silk, iron, grain, gold. Uniform standards, fair scales, contracts that were honored. Then Almea vanished. Overnight. Not a war, not a plague, not an earthquake. It simply vanished. In the morning, there were cities and roads and caravans. By evening, ruins and ashes. No one knows what happened. But in Hedon, they say that Almea had become too powerful. She had woven the world into a single network. And someone decided that a single network was too dangerous. Because if one thread breaks, everything collapses. Daniel listened and felt a chill in his stomach. The same chill he'd felt in the dungeon before the stone tablet. Someone had destroyed Almea. Not by accident, on purpose. And now he was building the same thing on those very ruins. Master Yoon left 3 days later. He left the silk behind. He took the iron and stone with him. He shook Daniel's hand and said one sentence through Sora. He said he would return in 3 months, if Lowmark was still standing by then. It wasn't a question, it was a warning. Sora stayed in Lowmark. Daniel offered her the position of ambassador for Eastern affairs. She accepted. She was given a room in the castle next to Evelyn's office. On her first evening, Sora took a stringed instrument out of her travel bag. It looked like a long wooden board with silk strings, a Gaia gym. She sat down by the window and began to play. The sound was soft. The melody was unfamiliar, sad and beautiful at the same time. Kana, who was sitting by the door to Daniel's office, turned her head toward the music. She listened, motionless. Then she stood up and went to her room. Daniel could hear the music through the wall. He was sitting over a map, sketching out new routes. The eastern route through the steppes, the northern route through Vallard, the southern route through the pass bearing the guild's seal. 3 directions, 6 inns, 1 trading house. The 11th month. The Hedon silk sold out in 3 days. All of it, down to the last scrap. Merchants from Wallard came specifically for it. They paid in silver without haggling. The silk that in Kant Almor cost 10 silver coins per piece, in Lowmark, it cost 6. Because there was no guild middleman. Direct delivery. A short route. Evelyn calculated the profit from the first Eastern shipment. 120 silver coins. In 3 days. She placed the slip of paper on Daniel's desk and said nothing. The numbers spoke for themselves. Daniel looked at the slip of paper, then at Evelyn. Then he said they needed a bank. Evelyn looked up. Daniel explained. Receipts are fine, but receipts are tied to the goods in the warehouse. If the warehouse burns down, the receipts will be nothing but paper. We need a system that works without physical goods, a system of trust, a bill of exchange system. A merchant in Wallard deposits 10 silver coins at the Lowmark Trading House branch. He receives a bill of exchange. He travels to Kant Almor. He presents the bill of exchange at the branch there. He receives 10 silver coins minus 1% for service. He doesn't need to carry silver along a road where robbers lurk. He doesn't need to hide money in his boot. He carries a piece of paper that is worth money only in the hands of the person whose name is written on it. Evelyn listened. Then she said that it would only work if people trusted a Lowmark paper more than silver in their pocket. Daniel said that was exactly why he'd spent 9 months building a reputation. Hallmarked weights, price boards, open books, arbitration. 1 year and 2 months. Lowmark had ceased to be a province. It had become a phenomenon. The trading house was up and running. Bills of exchange circulated among the 3 provinces. Merchants from Vallard and Kant Almor opened accounts. Even 2 men from Northern Hog arrived and deposited silver, cautiously, with suspicion. But they deposited it. Evelyn kept the records with a precision that even frightened Daniel. Every bill of exchange, every deposit, every transaction. The books were open. On Wednesdays, anyone could come and check them. No one ever came, but everyone knew they could. That was enough. 6 inns operated along the 3 routes. Grey Heather in the south, River Bridge in the north, Stone Threshold at the pass, Eastern Outpost on the Steppe Road, and Oak Shelter halfway to Vallard. And the new lights of Lowmark right by the market, the largest one, with 20 rooms, with a tavern, with stables for 30 horses, with a bathhouse that Daniel insisted on building after Mariel explained to him that half of all illnesses come from dirt. 190 stalls at the market, merchants from all 7 kingdoms, Eastern goods next to Western ones, silk next to iron, porcelain next to Lowmark's clay pots. Master Yoon had sent a 2nd caravan, and a 3rd. The Eastern route was working. 420 silver coins lay in Lowmark's treasury. That was more than the annual income of some baronies. Daniel spent almost nothing on himself. He wore the same clothes he had a year ago. He ate the same food as his workers. He slept on the same hay mattress that Alvin had offered to replace with a feather bed 3 times. All the money went back into the system. Roads, warehouses, security, salaries, the infirmary, the orphanage, and the school that Cedric had opened at the temple. Yes, the school. Daniel had insisted on it. 20 children were learning to read, count, and write. Sora taught them because she knew 6 languages and could explain complex things simply. The children adored her. They called her Lady Che-yun and drew cranes during class. But as they grew older, what Daniel had both hoped for and feared came to pass. Attention from the big players. First came a letter from King Wallard. Not an invitation, a demand. To appear at court to discuss the status of trade in the province of Lowmark. Alvin turned pale when he read it. He said that a demand from the king was not a request. It was an order. Gregor said they couldn't go. It might be a trap. Evelyn said they couldn't refuse to go. Refusing the king was treason. Lillian Ashford arrived the next day, without warning, on horseback, alone, wearing a traveling cloak bearing the smut of Vallard. She dismounted in the castle courtyard and asked for an audience with the lord. Lillian was a tall woman of 28, with dark hair pulled back and a face on which nothing moved except her eyes. Her eyes moved constantly. They scanned the room, the people, the books on the table, the schedule on the wall, the position of Hannah's swords, Evelyn's expression, all at once. She introduced herself as an observer from the Crown of Wallard. She said she had been sent to assess Lomark and compile a report for the king. She said she would live in the province for as long as necessary. She was a spy. Daniel knew it. Evelyn knew it. Gregor knew it. Hannah placed her hand on her sword and didn't remove it until Lillian had left the office. Daniel didn't pretend not to know. He invited Lillian to his office the next morning. She arrived exactly on time, right on the dot. Daniel placed a stack of papers in front of her. Lomark's financial report for the last quarter. Revenue, expenses, balance sheet, caravan routes, trade volumes, number of contracts, everything that would have taken her weeks to learn. Lillian looked at the papers, then at Daniel. She asked why he was giving them to her. Daniel said she'd find out anyway. He was just saving her time. 3 weeks, according to his calculations. He asked what she wanted to do with the time she'd saved. Lillian was silent for 14 seconds. Daniel was counting. Then she took the papers and left. She didn't smile. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say a single unnecessary word. But she read the report overnight, and in the morning, she came in with questions. Smart questions, precise ones. About the bill of exchange system, about securing receipts, about arbitration, about the Eastern route. Every question showed that she hadn't just read it, she'd understood it. Daniel answered for 3 hours. Lillian took notes. Then she stood up and said she'd continue tomorrow. And she left. Evelyn came in a minute later. She said that Lillian was dangerous. Daniel said he knew. Evelyn said that Lillian was smarter than anyone she'd ever met. Daniel said that was exactly why they needed to show her the truth, rather than hide it. You can fool a smart person once, but if you show them the truth, and the truth proves convincing, they'll become an ally. Not out of kindness, out of intelligence. Lillian lived in Lomark for 3 weeks. She went to the market. She talked to merchants. She checked the weights. She read contracts. She visited inns. She counted caravans. She observed arbitration proceedings. She went about her business in silence. She took notes. She didn't comment. After 3 weeks, she asked for a meeting with Daniel. She came with a single question. She asked how he had come up with it. Daniel looked at her and saw in her eyes not calculation, not analysis, curiosity, genuine human curiosity. He said he hadn't come up with it. He said he'd seen it work. Somewhere else. At another time. Lillian asked where. Daniel said it was far away, very far away. And he changed the subject. At the same time, a second letter arrived. From Northern Hog. The kingdom that had been stifling trade with tariffs and storms for 20 years now wanted to talk. Because the merchants of Hog were taking to the streets. They saw the caravans passing them by. To Lomark, through Lomark, past Hog. Money was flowing away, and the merchants were angry. Northern Hog wasn't demanding, it was asking, quietly for now, polite for now. But behind that politeness lay the desperation of a kingdom that had spent 20 years playing a game of control and had lost to the market. Daniel wrote a reply. He invited a representative from Hog to the Great Lomark Fair, which he announced would take place at the end of the year. In 2 months, 30,000 people, caravans from all 7 kingdoms, Eastern goods, Western goods, public accountability, arbitration, and one event that would change Lomark's status forever. Olvin asked what it was. Daniel said that Lomark would request the status of a free trading city. Olvin dropped his notebook. The 2 months of preparation for the Great Fair were the hardest of the entire year. Daniel slept 3 hours a night. Evelyn slept 4. Alvin stopped closing his notebook. He simply carried it open and jotted things down as he went. They were expanding the market. They tore down the old wooden stalls and put up stone ones. Kate and Rory worked in shifts around the clock. Bran was forging new weights. 3 sets for the 3 new rows. Gregor recruited 12 more soldiers, 38 men. He put them through their paces every morning. Hannah sometimes watched. Once she stepped onto the training ground and demonstrated a short sword technique to 2 soldiers. Gregor stood to the side and watched. Then he said that his soldiers fought like bears while she moved like water. Hannah didn't say anything, but the next day she came back. A week later, she was training 6 of them, in silence. She demonstrated the movements. She waited for them to repeat it. She demonstrated it again. Gregor didn't object. He was smart enough to admit that she was better than him. Mariel was preparing the infirmary for an influx of people. She told Daniel that 30,000 people meant disease. It meant wounds. It meant poisoning. It meant children who would get lost. She needed 2 more assistants and a 3-month supply of herbs. Daniel gave her everything she asked for. Mariel smiled. She'd been smiling more often lately. The warm, weary smile of someone who'd finally found a place where their work had meaning. One evening, she came to Daniel with a cup of herbal tea. He was sitting in his office poring over maps and didn't notice her come in. Mariel set the cup on the table and told him he was working too hard. Daniel said that the fair was coming up soon and there was no time to rest. Mariel sat down across from him. She said she knew people who had worked until they collapsed. She had treated them. She hadn't been able to save some of them. Daniel looked up. Mariel was looking at him with an expression he'd only seen before on the faces of people who cared not out of duty, but because they couldn't otherwise. He drank the herbal tea. It was bitter and warm. Mariel stood up and left. At the door, she paused and said she would bring him the tea every evening until he learned to go to bed before midnight. Daniel didn't argue. Ryan Ashton showed up 3 weeks before the fair. She arrived with 12 mercenaries on 12 horses, red-haired, freckled, loud, with a scar across her right eyebrow. She dismounted and asked who the Lord was. Daniel was standing in the square, discussing the layout of the new stalls with Cade. He turned around. Ryan looked down at him. She was half a head taller than him. She said she'd heard about Lowmark from every caravan driver from Hogg to the southern ports. She said she wanted a contract to guard caravans, a long-term one. Daniel asked how much she charged. Ryan named her price. Daniel listened for half an hour. She described the routes she knew, the spots where robberies occurred, the times of year when the roads were dangerous, and the number of people needed for each route. Expenses for fodder, for weapons, for replacing horses. She knew her business just as well as Evelyn knew numbers, down to the last copper coin. Daniel said he'd pay 1.5 times as much. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Daniel explained, not out of generosity, out of calculation. He didn't want her to leave for the competition in 6 months. Training a new security captain costs more than 1.5 salaries. Ryan laughed, loudly. Loud enough for half the market to hear. She said he was the first man to buy her work, not her. They signed the contract. 1 page. The Lowmark seal. Kedrick's blessing. Ryan and her 12 mercenaries integrated into the Lowmark system within a week. Gregor watched them with envy. They were better than his soldiers, more professional, more experienced. But Daniel explained to Gregor that his men guarded the castle and the city, while Ryan's men guarded the roads. Different tasks, different skills. Gregor accepted it. Not right away, but he accepted it. The Great Lowmark Fair began on the first day of the last month of the 2nd year. Daniel stood on the castle balcony and looked down. He couldn't believe his eyes. The square, which 2 years ago had been a wasteland with 15 stalls, was now too small to hold everyone. People stood from wall to wall. Caravans stretched along all 3 roads. The flags of the 7 kingdoms flew from the flagpoles at the entrance. The smell of spices, roasted meat, and fresh bread filled the air. Music played from Sora's eastern instruments and the western drums of hired musicians. 30,000 people, maybe more. It was impossible to count them all. Olven tried. He lost count at 6,000. The first day of the fair was spent trading. The second day was spent in negotiations. Ambassadors from the 3 kingdoms. Representatives from the 5 guilds. Baron Dane, who had arrived with his wife and son and proudly showed everyone his hallmarked weights. Master Yoon with his 4th caravan. Merchants from the provinces whose names Daniel didn't know. On the 3rd day, Evelyn stepped onto the platform in the center of the square. Thousands of people watched the stern woman in a dark dress, an account book in her hands. She read out Lomark's financial report for the year, aloud, in public, every figure, every income, every expense. How much the Lord had earned, how much he had spent. On what? The crowd was silent. Then they began to murmur. Then someone shouted that in 20 years of trade, this was the first time he'd heard the Lord say how much he'd earned. A merchant from Villard named Hartley, the very same one who'd issued the first promissory note, approached the platform and said he wanted to check the figures. Evelyn handed him the ledger. Hartley checked it for 20 minutes. Then he looked up and said one word to the entire square. Clean. The square erupted, not with applause, not with shouts, but with a roar. The roar of thousands of people who, for the first time in their lives, saw that power could be transparent. On the fourth day, Daniel submitted a petition, a document prepared jointly by Evelyn and Lillian, a petition to grant Lomark the status of a free trading city within the province. It was signed by 68 merchants from the 7 kingdoms, Baron Dane, a representative of the Duke of Alton, and one name that surprised everyone, Cassian Morven, head of the Comte Almore Merchants Guild. He sent a letter bearing his seal in which he endorsed the petition, because a free trading city is neutral territory. And neutral territory is a place where the guild can trade with anyone without worrying about royal duties. Cassian lost the battle for control, but he gained what he received in return. The status of a free trading city was granted 6 weeks after the fair, a parchment bearing 3 royal seals. Wellard, Comte Almore, Northern Hog. The 3 kingdoms, which for 20 years had been unable to agree on anything, signed a single document, because all 3 needed Lomark, and none of the 3 could allow the others to take it for themselves. The only compromise that satisfied everyone was neutrality. Alvin read the parchment aloud in the square before 1,000 residents of Lomark. His voice trembled. He had served 3 lords before Daniel. None of them had done anything worth reading aloud in the square. Daniel stood on the platform and looked at the people. At Thor, at the West Hall mayor, who had stood before him 2 years ago and said that the main problem was the road. The road had been built. At Merritt, who used to sell roots for a penny and now earned more than the city physician in the capital. At Bran, who had once come to watch the Lord make a fool of himself and now stood next to the castle with no intention of leaving. At Agnes of Mossbridge, who 2 years ago had to walk 3 miles for water and now drank from a well just 300 steps from her home. There were 210 stalls at the market. 2,300 people lived in the town, 6 inns, 1 trading house, 1 infirmary, 1 orphanage, 1 school, 38 of Gregor's soldiers, 12 of Ryan's mercenaries, 1 treasurer who kept track of every copper coin, 1 bodyguard who slept with his eyes open, 1 healer who treated patients for free, 1 ambassador who spoke 6 languages, 1 priest who was no longer afraid of money, 1 blacksmith who stayed not for the contract, 1 manager who sold a little book for 2 silver coins and kept a separate notebook for the Lord's new words. 2 years, 730 days, of stone and mud and 4 silver coins. After the ceremony came a celebration, the first real celebration in the history of the new Lomark. Not a fair, not a market day, a celebration for the people. Free food in the square, paid for by the treasury. Music, dancing, children ran between the stalls. Old people sat on benches and drank mulled wine. Sora played a melody on the gayagim that she had composed especially for this day. She sat on the platform and plucked the strings. The sound floated over the square, quiet and clear. People fell silent when they heard it, not because they were asked to, but because the melody was such that one wanted to listen. Hannah stood behind Daniel's shoulder, 2 swords on her back, her face impassive. But Daniel noticed. She was smiling. For the first time in half a year. A small smile, barely noticeable. The corners of her lips were raised by a millimeter, but it was a smile. Mariel was handing out sweets to the children from the infirmary's supplies, honey cakes she'd baked herself. The children swarmed around her on all sides. She laughed as she handed them out, and laughed again. Ryan was sitting by the beer barrels with the mercenaries. They were laughing so loudly that it could be heard across the entire square. Ryan was tapping her mug on the table and telling a story about a caravan that got lost in the fog and spent 3 days going in circles around the same hill. The mercenaries were roaring with laughter. Gregor stood off to the side. He wasn't drinking. He looked out at the square, at the people, at the soldiers he'd trained, at the walls he guarded, at the flags on the masts. Then he turned to Daniel and did something he'd never done before. He nodded, briefly, in a single motion. But that nod said it all. Respect. Recognition. Loyalty born not of fear but of the understanding that this man was worth serving. Evelyn stood on the platform next to the ledger. She wasn't dancing. She wasn't drinking. She stood there, looking out at the square. Daniel walked over to her. They stood side by side in silence. Then Evelyn said one sentence. She said the numbers added up. Daniel looked at her. Evelyn wasn't looking at the ledger. She was looking at the people, at the children, at the elderly, at merchants and soldiers and herbalists and blacksmiths. The numbers added up. It wasn't about accounting. It was about everything. Daniel nodded. Lillian approached him at the end of the evening. The square was emptying. The torches were burning out. The music had died down. Sora was carrying the Gaia gym back to the castle. Hannah walked 2 steps behind Daniel, as always. Lillian took a folded parchment from her belt and placed it in front of Daniel on the railing of the platform. Daniel looked at it. It was her report. A report to King Villard. Sealed. Ready to be sent. Daniel didn't read it. He asked what was in it. Lillian said it stated that Lomark could not be subjugated, but it was possible to become his friend. Daniel nodded. Lillian paused. Then she said she'd resigned from the king's service that morning. Daniel looked at her. For the first time since they'd met, Lillian wasn't controlling her facial expression. There was something new there. Not calculation, not analysis, not a cold assessment. A decision. A human decision made not by the head, but by something deeper. She said she wanted to stay, not as an observer, as part of Lomark. Daniel held out his hand to her. They stood on the platform, an empty square, fading torches, a dark sky dotted with bright stars, a breeze from the hills smelling of heather and smoke. Daniel looked out at the square, at the roads leading off in 6 directions, at the caravans that would begin arriving again first thing in the morning, at the castle on the hill with cracks in its walls and a huge ancient storeroom in the dungeons, at the people who had been starving 2 years ago and were now sleeping in warm homes with full pantries. He remembered the highway in Singapore, the headlights, heavy eyelids, his last thought before everything went dark. He never managed to finish optimizing the route for his client in Jakarta. He stood on a platform in the city center that he had built with his own hands. Not with a sword, not with magic, with spreadsheets and contracts, honest scales, and one simple idea: that trust is worth more than gold. Now he had finally completed that optimization. That night, deep within the castle, in the very lowest sealed chamber where no light reached and no sound penetrated, a symbol flashed on a stone tablet from ancient Almea. A warm, golden light ran along the lines of the diagram, the very arrows and nodes that Daniel had seen months ago. The light moved from the center to the edges, in 6 directions, precisely tracing the routes he had mapped out above. The symbol glowed for 10 seconds. Then it went out. But in the farthest corner of the room, behind a stone wall, beneath a layer of dust and time, something clicked, a mechanism that had not been touched by human hands for 300 years. Somewhere on the other side of the continent, in a windowless tower, a nameless man opened his eyes. On the table before him lay a stone slab, an exact replica of the one that had stood beneath the castle of Lomark. The same symbol had just flashed and gone out on it. The nameless man stared at the slab. His face betrayed no emotion. Then he stood up. He walked over to the window that wasn't there and ran his hand along the wall. The wall became transparent. Beyond it lay the continent of Erin. Cities, roads, rivers, mountains, and a tiny dot between the 3 kingdoms, glowing, like a star. The nameless man uttered a single word, again. He had seen this 300 years ago. The same light, the same dot, the same roots, the same threshold. Last time he had waited too long. Almea had grown too large, and its destruction had come at a high cost. This time, he would not wait. But this time, there was one thing he did not know. The man who lit the sign on the plaque was not from this world. He was from a world where the single market had not been destroyed but built, where container ships sailed across the oceans, where billions of people traded every day and the system didn't collapse. Because it wasn't built on magic, it was built on trust. And trust turned out to be stronger than any wall. Daniel Hale slept in his room on a hay mattress. Hannah sat by the door with swords on her lap. A carved fox stood nearby. Behind the wall, Sora plucked the strings of her gayagima, quietly humming a lullaby in the Heathen language. One floor below, Mariel was checking the herb supplies in the infirmary. A candle burned in the treasurer's office. Evelyn was counting. In the courtyard, Gregor was making his final rounds. Ryan was snoring in the barracks with a smile on her freckled face. Olvin sat by candlelight, copying a little book. The 34th copy. The price had risen to 3 silver pieces. In the dungeon beneath the castle, a golden light flickered on the plaque. Quietly, steadfastly, like a small fire that has no intention of going out. The game had truly begun. But Daniel Hale had known one thing for a long time. In his world, it was called the principle of anti-fragility, a system that people try to break but cannot become stronger with every attempt. Lowmark cannot be broken, because Lowmark isn't a castle, or a road, or a warehouse. Lowmark is thousands of people who benefit from its existence. It's merchants who make their living with honest scales, herbalists who receive a fair price, carters who aren't afraid for their cargo, children who are learning to read, the sick who are treated for free. Each of them is a thread, thousands of threads, a web that holds the world together. And anyone who tries to tear this web apart will find that it doesn't break. It bends. It springs back. It absorbs the blow and returns it. Because it was built by a man who knows that networks are stronger than walls, who knows that trust is stronger than magic, who knows that the most reliable protection in the world is when your destruction costs more than your existence. Daniel Hale, Lord of Lowmark, former senior logistics manager, had been sleeping and seeing no dreams. He didn't need dreams. His life had finally become what he had once only been able to plan out in spreadsheets, a journey that had reached its end.